Okay, we have 1 o'clock. It's my pleasure to welcome everybody who's joining. Thanks for tuning in to today's colloquium on the exceptional hypersaline ecosystem at Oregon's Lake Abert. My name is Theo Dreher. I'm a Professor Emeritus at Oregon State University and the President of the Oregon Lakes Association. And we're involved, the association's involved because we have a very strong interest in the conservation of Lake Abert. Let me just introduce with some slides and some words of introduction. It's always the host who messes things up, isn't it? Because you spend ages getting things ready, but still manage. Okay, so here we are. So we're talking today about Lake Abert, which is a lake, as I'm sure many know, in the southeast corner of Oregon, one of 3 hypersaline lakes in the Great Basin of the west of the US, together with Great Salt Lake and Mono Lake. Lake Abert is then obviously within this Great Basin and is on the Pacific Flyway, which is used by many birds on migrations, for instance, between Alaska and South America, and in migrations around the Great Salt Lake, as we'll hear about today. Lake Abert is well known as a venue for watching birds. In season, there are many, many birds that rely on Lake Abert for feeding up to power their migrations. But we're very spooked at the moment because Lake Abert is dry. It's been dry for the last 2 years, for 2021 and 22. It was also dry in 2014 to 16. And of course, under those conditions, it's not able to support the birds. So this is 2 desiccation periods within the last decade. Previous to that, it was the 1930s. So there was a long period where Abert was not dry. And so we're obviously very concerned about this. That concern has reached government, both at the federal level and at the state level. At the federal level, our Oregon Senator Merkley, together with support from bipartisan support from legislators in the Great Lakes, in the Great Basin states, recently led to the passage of the Saline Lakes Act, or the Saline Lake Ecosystems in the Great Basin states. Gosh, I can't see it from here. Act. So this is an act that authorizes the USGS to establish a regional program to assess, monitor, and benefit the hydrology of saline lakes in the Great Basin and the migratory birds and other wildlife that depend on those habitats and for other purposes. So in speaking about this act, Senator Merkley called out specifically Lake Abert because it's one of 3 really important lakes. Obviously, the Great Salt Lake, we've heard a lot of concern about recently, is also a keystone part of the ecosystems that support these migratory birds. And this act provides $25 million over 5 years to study this system. At the state level in Oregon, again, there's bipartisan interest in addressing this crisis. It's a crisis of the ecosystem, but there's also going to be a crisis in the agricultural systems in the Chewaucan Valley. So there's support currently for discussions that involve conservation groups like Oregon Lakes Association, Chewaucan natives, native tribes who've used the area in the past and still do, and government agencies. And there will there have been discussions that have got to the point where there will now be a mediated discussion arranged by Oregon Consensus at Portland State University and Oregon State. So it's in the context of this, the situation we're in, where Lake Abert has been dry now twice in the last decade, and where there's really a heightened interest widely and at the levels of government, that we need to find a solution so that Abert doesn't continue to go dry. We need information to be able to make decisions, the best decisions that have the best opportunity to to prevent further desiccation. And that's what this colloquium is about. We will hear about research that describes the Lake Abert ecosystem, various aspects of it, and that information we hope will be useful in the future for making decisions. We're not going to get into the decisions and the pros and cons about how that might be done today. We're going to hear about the science. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Ron Larson as the first speaker. I'll just stop sharing. Ron, you can share your screen now. So Ron retired recently from a career with the US Fish and Wildlife Service. He's a member of the board of the Oregon Lakes Association. And since retirement, Ron has spent a lot of time studying Lake Abert. He's published papers, and a book will appear towards the end of this year, published by the University of Nevada Press, focused on Lake Abert. And so Ron's talk is entitled An Introduction to the Recent Ecology, Hydrology and Conservation Status of Lake Abert. The talks are all 20 minutes. Hopefully there will be a little bit of time, a few minutes before we need to proceed to the next speaker. And there will be discussion opportunities during the break and at the end of the session. Okay, take it away, Ron.
Okay, can you hear me all right, Theo? And can you see my first slide?
All good, thanks.
Oh, perfect. Okay. Hey, thanks for that introduction, Theo. I think that was excellent. So I want to apologize because we're going to use a lot of superlatives in these talks about Lake Abert, but I think it really is an exceptional lake. And today I'm going to give you some brief information on the hydrology, ecology, and the conservation status of the lake. Oh, let me see here. I'm having trouble getting, oh, there we go. Okay. So Lake Abert is ecologically the most important water body in the northern Great Basin. Now, this might be an extreme statement, but that's what I believe. And the reason I believe that is the lake is so productive that it can seasonally support several 100,000 migratory water birds, with some breeding in the Arctic and others wintering in Argentina. That's its impact extends from one end of the Western Hemisphere to the other. Now let's look at the water. The Chewaucan River, as you can see on the right side, is the primary source of water for Lake Abert. Flows measured upstream of Paisley show that they are variable over time, but no long-term trend is evident. However, you can see here that since about the late 1990s, there has been a decline in flows in the river, shown by this red line. So that's obviously troubling. Now I want to turn to water levels in the lake. The lake shows similar long-term patterns as we saw in the river flows. Importantly, as Theo mentioned, the lake is desiccated several times, including the Dust Bowl era of the 20s and 30s, and more recently in 2014 and 15, and then again in 21 and 22, as shown by these blue circles. So why did the lake desiccate? Well, let's look at the river because it's the primary source of water for the lake. The two panels you see here on the screen show how flows varied during the Dust Bowl era of the 20s and 30s, over here on the left-hand side, and more recently, over here on the right-hand side. On the left panel during the Dust Bowl, you can see that there were exceptionally low flows, as indicated by these blue circles, and there were periods when it was below 10 CFS. A 10 CFS flow would be a creek you could jump over. So those were very exceptional periods. And so you can understand why the lake would have desiccated then. But looking over here at the right-hand panel, you notice there are no flows below 10 CFS, although there were a few flows in 21 that were quite low. But there were also some exceptionally high flows indicated by these two red circles, where flows were above 1,000 CFS. And so based on this, you can see that these two periods were quite different. And so I'm wondering why the lake was desiccated in this recent period. And so in this next slide, we're going to look at that a little bit more closely. So what I've got here are 4 time periods. The one that we've already talked about, the Dust Bowl era of the 20s and 30s, another period in the 1980s and early 90s when flows were quite low, but the lake did not desiccate then. I've indicated periods when the lake desiccated by these red lines, and then the 2 periods more recently when it's desiccated. And what I'm trying to show here is that it's pretty clear that in the Dust Bowl, flows were very low and consistently low. And that you can see that by this narrow range between the minimum, maximum, and the quartiles. Whereas when you look at more recent flows, especially in 2017 to 2022, there was a much more variation in the flows and some exceptionally high flows, as you can see here this period. So this really makes me wonder why the lake went dry here and it didn't here. And one of those factors that's likely the irrigation diversions upstream of the lake, and the other is climate change and warming and its effect on evapotranspiration. Now I want to turn to the ecology of the lake. When the lake is suitable, the lake can be highly productive and support a large biomass of Ctenocladus algae that you see here, and brine shrimp, as seen up here, as well as alkali flies, which at times can be so numerous that they look like tar that has blown ashore on the lake shore. And you can see that in these 2 photos here. And in this photo, you can see how densely packed the flies are. So we're talking about an extreme biomass of flies. So why is the lake so productive and important to birds? Well, first, it's shallow and has high concentrations of plant nutrients, which leads to high biomass of Ctenocladus and other algae. Secondly, it has a relatively simple food web with no fish and usually no predatory insects. Thus, more food is available for birds. And finally, flies and brine shrimp are the size that can be readily eaten by birds and are accessible to birds because the lake is so shallow. In this slide, I'm showing that, let me see if I can get rid of that thing. In this slide, I'm showing that brine shrimp can be extremely abundant. And what we're looking at over here on the left-hand side are what's called cysts, which are really eggs that have embryos, and then swarms of Artemia brine shrimp that occur in shallow water, and that each one of these swarms, I've got some circle here, contain thousands of adult shrimp. Now returning to the alkali flies, we saw earlier that the adults were highly numerous along the shore, but they're also very abundant in the lake, and at times can cover most of the surface of the lake, and you can see that here in this photograph. And when this photo was taken, I estimated that there were probably around 10 flies per square foot, and that would equal about 10 to the 10th adult flies being present, which is a huge biomass of flies. And in this little video, I want to zoom in so you can see that there's very numerous flies, you know, hundreds perhaps in these patches to fewer numbers scattered over the surface. But I think that gives you kind of a sense that these flies can present almost a limitless food supply for birds. Now let's look at some possible explanations for the abundance of flies. In this graph, I plotted change in elevation indicated by the blue circles and blue dashed lines, and the relative numbers of flies indicated by this red line. The elevation data comes from a gauge which is located in the lake, and the fly data is based on my photos and notes that I took, and is a relative measure from 1 to 5, with 5 being the highest. And you can see that there seems to be some relationship. When the lake is high, the numbers of flies are also high. And when the lake gets lower, the numbers of flies get lower, especially look at this period more recently when both the lake levels and numbers of flies were quite low. And I think later in the Dave Herbst is going to discuss how flies are affected by salinity and lake elevation. Now let's look at the birds. When the lake salinity is suitable, it attracts thousands of water birds of many species that feed voraciously on shrimp and flies prior to migrating, as Theo mentioned in the introduction, with some like the Wilson's phalarope, shown here and over here, migrating long distances from their summer range in Western North America, especially at the saline lakes that Theo mentioned, and their winter range in southern South America, which includes salt lakes just on the east side of the Andes. So you can see this is just one example of how Lake Abert is important to birds. Of the 80 species of water birds seen at the lake, Wilson's phalarope that I just mentioned is the most plentiful. In some years, its abundance is truly remarkable, as you can see in this photograph. And anyone that's tasked with counting these birds is likely to just get a migraine headache from them. Chris Hinkle of Bend estimated that there were over 300,000 phalaropes in this one flock. And I challenge anyone to come up with a different number. And I'd be happy to send this photograph to them if they want to try. Needless to say, Lake Abert and the other salt lakes that support Wilson's phalaropes and the other shorebirds are critically important, as Susan Haig and Nathan and Stan Senner will cover later. I have mentioned the importance of productivity for Lake Abert shorebirds, but why? Well, first, shorebirds have been called gluttons of the vertebrate world because of their high rates of food intake. Secondly, they can increase their weight by 10% per day, which is higher than similarly sized birds. And third, their high food intake is needed because the rapid metabolism and extreme energy needs of migration. And fourth, some shorebirds like Wilson's phalaropes that migrate thousands of miles nonstop will add fat equivalent to 50% of their body weight prior to migration. So thus, to meet these needs, food needs to be abundant just prior to migration. Finally, let's look at the possible effects low lake levels has on the ecosystem. As shown in this graph, when the lake recedes, black represents the area, and red represents salinity. And you can see that it's kind of confusing, but these two factors are inversely related, so that as area declines, salinity increases. And I've highlighted two areas here, 2014, 15, and 21 and 22. You can see here that the lake area was quite small, and at that same time, the salinity was very high. And that was really evident in July of 2014 when I took this photo. And you can see that it's blood red, and that's because of the high abundance of a bacteria-like organism called archaea, which only lives in extremely high salinity conditions. Because climate change is likely to affect both precipitation and evaporation, and thus have impacts on the lake, as we will learn from two later speakers, Larry O'Neill and Erica Fleishman, this suggests that the lake will experience more frequent desiccation events unless more water gets to it. Fortunately, a group of ranchers and environmentalists have formed to discuss this issue. And Theo mentioned that in his introduction. And therefore, I am hopeful about the lake's future. So in a way of conclusion, Lake Abert is extraordinary in many respects, but primarily because of its high productivity and the large numbers of birds using it. The lake is highly productive at low to moderate salinities due to the great abundance of algae, brine shrimp, and alkali flies. Third, the fact that the lake desiccated recently for the first time in 80 years is cause for concern because it reduced both productivity and impacted birds. Fourth, the loss of Lake Abert could have serious consequences for shorebirds, such as the snowy plover shown below, because shorebirds have declined by an estimated 36%, according to the recent State of the Birds report. So with that, I want to thank you for your attention, and I want to direct you to the Oregon Lakes Association and the Oregon Natural Desert Association websites, which have additional information about the lake. And please support these organizations by becoming members. And I wish to thank all of these individuals listed here for their assistance and encouragement. And if you have any questions, you can contact me at this address. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron. We do have some time for questions. So I'm not sure that I can see everybody. If you raise your hand, you can write in the chat a question, or that you want to ask a question, or just unmute yourself and ask the question now. As I say, we have a few minutes.
I guess I covered that information too quick. I apologize for that.
No, but nothing to apologize for.
Yeah, Theo, you've recorded it, so all the talks will be on the Oregon Lakes Association website, so people can look at that and.
Correct. We will distribute through OSU and OLA. You'll get an email about that in a few days. Jay Munyon, Jay, go ahead if you want to ask, or do you want me to ask it? Jay Munyon is asking, is there temperature data associated with the gauge at Paisley? Is all land private between Paisley and Lake Abert? So Ron, is there temperature data?
There's no, as far as I know, there's no temperature data. And yes, pretty much all the land, especially the low-lying land in the two marshes, is privately owned. The BLM does own almost all of the uplands. And the Forest Service also owns land, upstream of Paisley.
Dan Roby, go ahead and ask.
Thanks, Ron. That was a great presentation. I was wondering if you could address the differences and similarities between Lake Abert and Summer Lake, which is not far away, in terms of how much more important Lake Abert is for migratory water birds, and differences in elevation levels for the two lakes, if you know about that.
Well, that's a great question. Yeah, and fortunately, you might think these are sister lakes because they're obviously part of Lake Chewaucan during the Pleistocene, but they're quite different now. Lake Abert is more often contains water than Summer Lake. Summer Lake is very ephemeral. It goes through a period of having water and not having water almost every year. And consequently, there's very little production of invertebrates in the lake. And in most of Summer Lake, you rarely see birds, although where the Anna River flows into Summer Lake, there are large concentrations of birds, especially snowy plover. And then in the wildlife management area, of course, there's high concentrations. I think it would be a really interesting study to try to understand what the differences are in these lakes. I think one of the factors is that any of you that have been to Summer Lake notice that there's huge plumes of alkali that blow up off of the playa during the summer. And there's evidence that that has actually depleted the salt concentration of Summer Lake, so it's not nearly as saline as Lake Abert. I think with that, I'm going to leave it.
Okay, Sue, you have the floor. Sue Haig is an ornithologist who recently retired from the USGS in Corvallis. She's always had an appointment with the Department of Fisheries, Wildlife and Conservation Sciences at OSU, and she's continuing in that role. And she will talk to us today about bird dependency on Lake Abert and nearby wetlands. Go ahead and share your screen and take it away, Sue.
Okay. While I'm figuring this out, we wrote a paper actually in the 90s comparing Lake Abert and Summer Lake, to tell you the truth. I'm not sure why. Let's see. Hang on a second. There we go. Are you guys seeing?
No, I think you were hovering over that symbol, but you did. I'm not sure that you clicked on it. Go back there to that pedestal symbol at the bottom.
At the bottom of the Zoom screen?
Bottom of your PowerPoint screen. To go full screen. You're not full screen at the moment. We can just see your desktop.
Oh, then I'm okay.
Yep,
Did that
that's
work?
good. Yes.
Okay, so you're seeing the full screen?
We are, yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so anyway, I started working on wetlands in the Sonic region, and the Sonic being an abbreviation for Southern Oregon, Northeastern California, in 1994. And we've taken an approach whereby we've looked at a series of wetlands. We've concentrated a lot of work on Lake Abert, but in order to really understand Lake Abert, I believe you have to look at the surrounding wetlands. So today, what I'd like to do is give you kind of a broader view of the importance of Abert, but with some perspective by looking at the other wetlands as well. So there we go. And the way to do that in my mind, is to look at the issue of connectivity, or to at least understand the concept of connectivity. And you can define connectivity many ways. You can think about it in terms of whether birds are vectors of connectivity of different wetlands, or whether the wetlands themselves are connected. In this case, we're obviously not thinking of the wetlands being connected, but as the talk goes on, I think you'll see how you can see why we started to think that the birds were vectors of connectivity. And when you think about how, or when I come to learn to think about how we should study birds, or at least look at what factors are affecting birds, I believe we have to look within seasons, what wetlands. I'm always thinking about water birds, right? So what wetlands are important to birds within a season, and then of course, what is going on between seasons. There you go. So in this talk, what I'm trying to do, or what I'd like to do, is show you how we have to consider what issues of connectivity to look at different temporal scales, so different phases of the annual cycle, and at different spatial scales. Okay, so Ron touched on what's important about Great Basin sonic wetlands, and Stan and Nathan will go on to talk about it in more detail, but I'm going to be the in-between person, I guess, and give you some perspective. So just to put us on the same page, these are the flyways that birds tend to follow in North America. And for the birds that are coming to our part of the Great Basin in Lake Abert, if this is kind of about where it is, I might be off. They're breeding up, many of them are breeding up in Alaska, up in the Arctic, and they come down and they'll spend a lot of time, or not so much, in our neck of the woods, and then they continue on. But there are also a significant number of birds that are not just blowing through, that are spending time breeding at Abert and at the surrounding wetlands. And I think that we have to be sure to remember that there are those birds, because without that, we really don't have much productivity in our neck of the woods, in the sonic region. Oops. So to broaden it a little bit, so as Ron mentioned, there are three, or Theo mentioned, we have three hypersaline wetlands in the Great Basin, right? There's the Great Salt Lake, there's Abert Lake, and then down here there's Mono Lake. And they are very productive in terms of the invertebrates that they produce. And then there are these saline lakes, Harney Lake, if it shows up, Malheur Lake, if it's there, Goose Lake, and Honey Lake, Walker Lake. The salinities vary as why does it do that? The salinities vary as the temperatures vary, but these are relative estimates of salinity. And then there's some freshwater lakes, and we'll talk about that more as time goes on in this talk. But the idea that we have this mosaic of wetlands with the mosaic of different types of salinity has come to be very important in our understanding of why places like Abert are important for certain times of the year and certain birds, and not as much at other times. So when we talk about a place like Abert, as Ron mentioned, so there's superabundant prey, right? So obviously it's good for birds to pack on the pounds. You want to get ready for migration and for winter. And one thing people don't necessarily think about is not only do they pack on the pounds, or it's not really pounds, but it's also important for post-breeding feather replacement. Birds are going through molts, and those nutrients that they're gaining at Abert and other places are really helpful as they go through the molt. Whoops. So a number of years, well, many years ago, almost 30 years ago, I started to study with Lou Oring from the University of Nevada, where we decided we wanted to see just even how a small, closely related group of birds use these wetlands. And we put radios and color bands, and we used actually stable isotopes to look at movements of shorebirds. And just to give you a quick idea of what we found, the birds, when we looked at movements throughout the annual cycle, we tracked birds from breeding to migration to winter and back again. When we looked at Killdeer, we found out that Killdeer used freshwater sites. They didn't go anywhere, basically. They sat right where they were. If it got cold, they would move south, maybe a couple of miles, but basically they didn't go anywhere. When we looked at willets, willets spent the smallest amount of time they could in the Great Basin. They spent 90% of their time in a very small home range on San Francisco Bay. And when they came to breed, they didn't mess around. They went to a single site, they bred, and they got the hell out of Dodge. They were very tightly keyed into a particular site, and it was mostly a freshwater site, but the adults would forage on a saline site. The flip side were avocets. Avocets bred near freshwater. Perhaps you're beginning to see a trend here, but they would move all over the place, foraging at saline and hypersaline sites. So we would see, we had avocets moving from Summer Lake to Abert, back and forth, but then we'd have them show up at Honey Lake. We had the Honey Lake birds would move north at the end of the year and end up at Abert. We had Summer Lake birds ending up at the Great Salt Lake. I mean, avocets move around. And it got us thinking, well, what is the deal with this freshwater saline? You know, why are they doing this? And so it got us to thinking perhaps it had something to do with why they bred where they bred. So we spent a number of years actually doing these salinity experiments, where we did experiments in the lab with exposing different species of shorebird chicks to different water regimes. And what we found was when chicks were exposed to the amount of water, or the type of the amount of salinity you would find like at Abert, they would die within a couple days. And to make a long story short, basically it's all water birds have a salt gland when they are living in an environment such as the Great Basin. And the salt gland is up, at the top of their skull. It's a supraorbital gland, and it is used for osmoregulation. But that gland is not well developed until they're adults. And so chicks don't have it. And so what that means is that adults have to have their chicks, they have to raise chicks near fresh water. And what that means in terms of someplace like Abert is those freshwater inflows have got to be maintained, or the birds aren't going to make it. And it means that the areas around Abert, Summer Lake Wildlife Area, not Summer Lake, but Summer Lake Wildlife Area, some of the Warner wetlands, and so forth, those freshwater areas are the breadbasket for reproduction in the sonic area. Abert itself is not necessarily a great place to raise chicks. It's a great place to spend the post-breeding period, but without the freshwater inflows, it is basically a sink for raising chicks. So this kind of summarizes what we found. If you're a hatchling, you want to be in freshwater. If you're a juvenile, you still want to be in freshwater, and you can start to ease your way into saline water. If you're an adult, you want to go to where the food is, which is in the hypersaline areas, but you need to raise your chicks in freshwater. Okay, so waterbird chicks need fresh water. Okay, quickly then, just some results we had from working on climate change. As you might expect, well, we looked at a 100-year database for various different factors. And what we found was that the results vary across the Great Basin, but as you can imagine, the temperature increased over this 100-year period. And what we found was the temperature increased more from 1980 forward than it did as over the entire, well, in this case, 80-year period. So the mean increase was about 61, the mean increase per decade over the entire period was about 16 degrees Fahrenheit. Whereas when we looked at the period from 19, how did I do this? From 1980 to the current period, it was a 41 degree Fahrenheit increase. So, I mean, it's not a surprise, but it's been a phenomenal increase in temperature most recently. When we look at precipitation, precipitation is not increased as drastically, or decreased rather, as drastically as temperature, but I find it, it's a little, they're not exactly equal to compare. But as you look, you can see again, if you look across those, the map, it varies across the Great Basin. And we have data for every last little data point you want to look at, but just to give you an overall idea, the same pattern held for precipitation, which is the results didn't change that much. So we got to about 1980. So overall, we had about 1.15 millimeters less rain per decade. But when we looked at the most recent time, we had a much greater decrease in precipitation. The thing is, though, the deal with precipitation is it goes hand in hand with temperature, particularly in the Great Basin, because it's tied to snowmelt. So the warmer it is throughout the year in the Great Basin, the faster the snow melts, which means the faster the water comes, which means the faster it evaporates, which means the less we have for water birds throughout the year. When we look at the projections, the US, we look at projections for snowpack for the Western US, it's projected to decline by 60% in the next 30 years, which is not really good news. Okay, one thing we did to try and, these Great Basin data, or these climate change data sets are incredibly difficult to find and compare because they're all different years and different ways they were collected. But we did use to try and come up with a better estimate of how things were changing closer to home for the Great Basin. We used the USGS hydroclimatic data network, which is a series of stream gauges which are put in places where there's not as much human involvement, and they're the purest ways that we were able to actually measure changes. And when you look, hydrologists look at these sorts of things, they think about measuring water in terms of a water year. And the water year is supposed to start, they start looking at it the 1st of October. And when we looked over this 100-year period, we found that, first of all, the water year, that is when the water starts appearing, was beginning sooner. And that's because the snow was melting faster. And overall, we found that we were losing 1 to 2 water days per decade, which if you multiply that times 10 decades, that's a lot. That's 10 to 20 days with no water in the Great Basin. That's since we started collecting data. That's a lot. I mean, that's an entire breeding season for a number of water birds. So the impact has been quite dramatic. The hardest thing to do with these data sets is find some sort of biological measurement. And to just be quick about this, because the models are a little bit of a pain to look at, we use the Breeding Birds Survey, which is the best data set we could come up with to keep it short. And we chose 14 Great Basin water birds. And we were very careful about how we chose the exact data that we used. And basically we found across the Great Basin, bird population trends during every phase of the annual cycle that we looked at were linked to changes in climate change. So we found it was a significant decrease in the number of birds relative to climate factors for this list of species. So that was not necessarily encouraging. Wait a minute. Let's see what happened to my thing here. Okay, so where does this leave us in terms of the flyway? Here we are, we're supposed to be the breadbasket, right? Now, when we think about Alaska, Alaska is undergoing significant climate change, and the decreasing viability of waterbird habitat is progressing quite quickly. If we are not doing so well, and the areas further south are not doing great, and then we think about a lot of shorebirds and waterbirds use the ocean, and the ocean chemistry is changing the food availability quite a bit. This is not really a happy talk. It is not so good. So I think that we have to think quite seriously about what places like Abert are able to provide, and we have to think quite seriously about what it is that we can do to help Abert and to the areas around it in order to provide the best we can for the birds that we're worried about. And I think maybe I will stop there because I'm running out of time, right?
So you have 5 minutes more.
Oh, I do. Well, in that
You can open
case,
it to questions now, or if you have some more to say, yeah, go ahead.
okay, well, I could go on about what we could potentially do, but maybe I should stop for questions. It's whatever you think.
Up to you.
Okay, well, I guess maybe what to do next, maybe I'll just, without going through all the slides, I think that what's important in terms of Oregon and Abert and just the surrounding wetlands is I think it's just very important to understand how important fresh water is to places and to the birds that are using Abert. The migrants that are coming through are adults, or they're birds that have fledged, so that they're good to go. But there are very significant freshwater inflows going into Abert, and those are really important to maintain and to recognize. And I think that the freshwater that's around the vicinity, Summer Lake Wildlife Area, the Chewaucan area, those areas are, I think people tend not to necessarily recognize how important those are if we want to have any productivity from the area that's at Abert or surrounding it. And I think that we can kind of get lulled into thinking that the area around Abert is very productive, but we're looking at migrants. I mean, for the most part, we're looking at migrants. We are not looking at our local populations. And so I think it's important that when we think about recovery efforts or management or whatever it is we're going to do for Abert, that we remember that we're dealing with different sets of birds that are coming through and that are using it. And I guess that would be my biggest point. So maybe I'll stop there and see if there are any questions.
Thank you, Sue. Could I ask straight away, could you give a sort of more specific idea of the number of birds in the two groups, say that just the migrants who are going through who really don't need the fresh water, and the other group that are using it to breed, and so numbers and the types of species, and say that perhaps the number of species.
Well, to be honest, most of the water birds that, well, see, this is the problem. This is another point, actually. The emphasis on management of water birds in Oregon, well, in any state really, is on waterfowl. And so, for example, there aren't that many places we can actually manage the water or manage for species, but Summer Lake Wildlife Area would be one, the Warner Wetlands, and Abert, that's debatable, but I don't know exactly the numbers of non-waterfowl species because and we're the only people that have been out there for very long to actually go out and count things. I don't have those numbers right on, I don't know right away. Actually, Nathan and Stan might be able to talk about exactly the numbers. There's an issue that honestly, for the last, we've worked out there for over 30 years or more. Lou Oring worked out there longer than I did, but there's never been any money to work out there, out in the Great Basin, out in Oregon, in the Sonic region. The money there just hasn't been. We've scraped together money from the craziest places to be able to continue to work out there. And so there's very little information aside. I mean, Ron's worked out there a little bit, and of course, there just hasn't been any bird work really, or very little aside from what we've been able to do. So there aren't numbers, and that's a problem. So I guess one thing that I would hope would come from maybe this new money is that people would start looking at things like herons and bitterns and other species than just ducks. The problem or an issue is that, well, I'll just say it. The issue is that the money's been given to the hydrologists of USGS and not the biologists. And so I am concerned that the biological issues won't be addressed when they really seriously need to be addressed.
All right, thanks, Sue. People, check the chat. Ivan Arizmendi has listed the paper that has data that Sue talked about. Bob Hughes, we'll get back to your question in a bit. Sue, John Ruland with the Eastern Oregon Audubon Society has done some counts. Ron's been involved with those. There are a few counts there. John or Ron, maybe you can post something about that in the chat. But let's move to the next speaker. Thanks very much, Sue. Can you relinquish the screen, please?
Yes, I will try.
So it's now my pleasure to introduce Stan Senner and his son Nathan. Stan, I believe, will be presenting this joint paper, but Nathan, I believe, is on hand and can answer questions. Maybe he'll chime in. So Stan and Nathan have spent years studying the migratory birds of the Pacific Flyway and the Intermountain West. Stan recently retired from the National Audubon Society, and Nathan is an assistant professor in the Department of Environmental Conservation at the University of Massachusetts. So is that still your screen?
Yep,
oh, there,
that's my
Stan.
screen.
Excellent. Take it away, Stan.
Oops, well, hang on one more second.
Yep. Sounding good, and it looks good. Yep.
All right, there we go. Thank you, Ron. I mean, Theo and Ron and Sue for the earlier talks. So Theo, you just introduced us, so I don't need to say any more about that, except both Nathan and I are former Oregon residents. I now live in Montana and Nathan in Massachusetts. I'm going to do a little real-time editing of my talk to try and de-emphasize some of the points that are overlapping with Ron and Sue, and maybe I can highlight a few others along the way. You've already seen images of the Pacific Americas Flyway. We call it Pacific Americas because that flyway spans both North and South America. Something like 1 billion birds of 350 species or more are using even just the North American part of that flyway. So it's very, very significant. And often when one thinks of the Pacific Flyway, you're thinking primarily of the long rocky coast and major estuaries like San Francisco Bay. But the Flyway does come inland, and Lake Abert, Klamath, Great Salt Lake are all part of the Pacific Flyway. The Intermountain West joint venture identified 18 saline and freshwater lakes and wetland complexes as key sites for shorebirds within the Western interior. And those sites are among many, both to the north and the south. This map is from Wurzbaugh et al. In 2017, and it highlights some of the larger saline lakes and hypersaline lakes like Abert right here. We've added 2 to this image just because of their importance for Wilson's phalaropes, Chaplin Lakes up here in Saskatchewan, and Laguna Marchiquita down here in Argentina. And between those 2, that sort of spans the flyway as it relates to Wilson's phalaropes. And a key point here is that saline lakes up and down this system are in trouble. And the Western interior is no exception. Donnelly et al. In 2019, I think, compared lake surface area in terminal basins fed by snowmelt in two periods, 1984 through to 1999, and then compared that with the years 2000 through 2018. And they found that lake surface area declined by 27%, wetlands area declined by 47% in that time period. So a couple dozen shorebird species regularly migrate to or through the Intermountain West. And numerically, at least 8 of them are of global importance. You can see here in these percentages, the percentages of world populations using the Western water bodies. This is the region as a whole now, not Lake Abert specifically. 14% for Western sandpipers on the low end, and up around 90% on the high end for Wilson's phalaropes and American avocets. So these are percentages of global populations. Marbled godwit, highlighted here in turquoise, is identified as a species of high conservation concern, while those in yellow are all considered to be of moderate conservation concern. Sue mentioned breeding willets, killdeer, American avocet in the region, but we also wanted to highlight snowy plover, where we have 20% of a global population, and long-billed curlews at 28%. And those two species are considered to be of highest or greatest conservation concern. And it's not irrelevant to mention that the snowy plover is breeding only, a couple hundred miles to the west along the Pacific coast, are already classified as threatened under the Federal Endangered Species Act. Waterfowl like pintails, reddy ducks, and waterbirds like pelicans and ibis rely on a mix of lakes and wetlands in the Intermountain West. Northern pintail is one of the species that benefits from spring flood irrigation on agricultural lands. The eared grebe up here on the right is probably the species most heavily dependent on saline and hypersaline lakes, including Abert, Mono, and Great Salt Lake. I should mention, in response to the question before about relative numbers, I did see one set of numbers that for breeding waterfowl in the Chewaucan marshes, there are about 400 pairs of several species, primarily, I think it was gadwall and several other species. So there are some breeding waterfowl in the area. I have not seen any numbers for long-billed curlew and some of the other birds that would be breeding in the surrounding areas. So the abundant brine flies and brine shrimp that can be found in hypersaline lakes are only present when water conditions and salinity are within a certain range. And the same is true for the birds that rely on them. Paper that Nathan and others, including myself, published used data by BLM and the East Cascades Audubon Society. And we were able to document that bird use at Abert declined by up to 82% when water is low and salinity is very high. Conversely, when water is high and salinity is low, bird use also declined, although not by that same magnitude. When conditions at Abert are good, the numbers of birds stopping there are of regional and, more importantly, global significance. The threshold of 1% of a species population is used to identify areas of global importance by the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands, the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network, and the System of Important Bird Areas identified by Audubon and BirdLife International. So when you look at these percentages, all of them are 1% or more, and 5 of them indicate, those 5 species indicate global significance for Abert, and 2 more of regional significance. Although the numerical importance of Lake Abert and other interior water bodies and wetlands is well documented, we have much to learn about how these sites function as a network for migrants. This spaghetti map shows depicts recoveries of banded birds, primarily waterfowl, whose movements either originated in or ended at one of the sites shown by the white dots. This would be Great Salt Lake here, and then you can look on down the chain. That's probably the Salton Sea there. So you can also see there are cross flyway connections here to the central flyway, breeding birds here moving into the interior west during migration and perhaps headed to the coast for the winter. There are even birds moving all the way to the Atlantic coast and the Gulf of Mexico. And this demonstrates that these many birds rely on networks that extend far beyond the Western interior. And really, it's helpful to think there's a regional network, there's a national network, and then there's an international network. And the birds are dependent on networks at all three scales. Of special interest is Wilson's phalarope, which uses saline lakes in the high arid Andes in Bolivia, Argentina, and Chile here, known as the lithium triangle. And this area produces lithium for our expanding green technologies, such as cell phones, electric cars, and energy storage. Mining in this area typically involves massive amounts of groundwater, often at the expense of the birds like flamingos and phalaropes and indigenous people who rely on these same landscapes and water. Laguna Mar Chiquita, which I showed you on that earlier map, is not shown here, but it would be to the south. Surveys there have documented as many as 500,000 Wilson's phalaropes during the boreal winter, austral summer. And undoubtedly, those are the same birds that are recorded earlier at places like Abert in the late summer and fall. Although the banding data on the earlier spaghetti map are intriguing, they don't answer questions about how the network is used. And Sue Haig already walked through some of her examples of breeding avocets, for example, juvenile birds commuting between Summer Lake and Lake Abert, adult birds from places like Carson Lake in Nevada and Honey Lake and so on, moving north post-breeding to take advantage of the rich food supplies. So I don't need to give you any details here. But if you take what Sue said, it's very clear that the interior water bodies and wetlands function as a network and the whole is essential. But we lack comparable information on many other species, especially for migrants like Wilson's phalaropes. So we know the numbers of birds using some of these places, but what we're really lacking is an understanding of how that system is used in some kind of integrated way. This image depicts likely, and I stress likely, movements of eared grebes between mid-continent nesting areas up here down to the lakes of the Intermountain West and then on south, in their case, to places like the Gulf of California where they overwinter. What I want to emphasize, though, is that questions about how different species use the network are not just of academic interest, but in fact are essential to understanding what happens when one or more sites become so degraded or inconsistent in their conditions that they're effectively useless. At what point is the ecosystem failing in that it no longer functions as a network of lakes that can sustain bird populations? Well, we can look to the Yellow Sea coast in China and Korea, the two Koreas, I should say, for an example of the impact of the loss of a migratory network. Shown in red, and there's a lot of red here, unfortunately, these are areas on the Yellow Sea coast that lost 100% of their mudflats between 1960 and 2010, all to be filled in for use for industrial and other purposes. The effect on migratory shorebirds has been catastrophic. In the graph here, the horizontal axis represents the degree to which a species' relative reliance on the Yellow Sea, while the vertical axis represents their per year population trend over the 20 years from 1993 through 2012. Those species that rely most heavily on the Yellow Sea also have declined most dramatically And some of those species are now critically endangered. Nearly 30 years ago, Western ornithologists Joe Gell and Ned Johnson were remarkably prescient in expressing this concern about the effects of declining water levels on birds across the network of saline lakes. I think you can all read that, so I won't repeat it for you. And then even earlier than that, 50 years ago, Phillips and Van Den Berg in a USGS publication observed that after, and you look here at the quote, observed that after the Chewaucan marsh and irrigation practiced upstream of Lake Abert, the lake would receive less inflow in dry years than it previously did. So the insights on these two slides taken together, I think, are critical, because sometimes I hear it said that if Lake Abert goes dry for long periods of time, so what? The birds will just go somewhere else. Well, in our current environment, that idea is problematic for probably multiple reasons, but I'll mention two. First, we're rapidly running out of alternative sites. And second, there weren't many sites to begin with that have the superabundant food supplies needed to support hundreds of thousands and even millions of birds like eared grebes and Wilson's phalarope. So if you hear that it doesn't matter when a lake, one of these key sites goes dry because birds will go somewhere else, don't buy it. The degradation of the Western water network couldn't come at a worse time, as shorebird populations are declining across the continent. 2019, Rosenberg et al. Published a paper in Science documenting the loss of 3 billion North American breeding birds since 1970. Shorebirds figure prominently in these declines. The trends for short distance migrants here, long distance migrants here, and the overall trend for all the species combined are unfortunately very clear. And although not shown here, two of the key species found in the Western interior, long-billed dowitchers and Western sandpipers, have declined by 54 and 25% respectively. That's dramatic. Although the IUCN classifies Wilson's phalarope, shown here at Great Salt Lake, and eared grebes as species of least concern, based on their large populations, this rating should be taken with a grain of salt. Looking at the demise of passenger pigeons, Carolina parakeets, and Eskimo curlews in North America, we know that abundance is no guarantee against extinction. And it's clear that large concentrations of birds at one site or combinations of vulnerable sites can be a formula for disaster. In the not so distant future, we would not be surprised to see petitions for listing species like the ear grebe under the Federal Endangered Species Act, especially if recent predictions for Great Salt Lake are borne out. So I want to look forward here, and I'm going to leave the data and the science behind and just try and make some observations that frame, I think, some of the challenges and solutions ahead. First, it's clear that problems with water supply in the already arid Intermountain West are not going away, and they threaten birds and the livelihoods of people throughout the region. It's not birds versus people, it's both people and birds. Secondly, since water issues are affecting or will affect birds and people, we need solutions that work for birds and people. We can't turn back the clock to the days before European settlement. So the first priority is for conversations among local and regional stakeholders, as well as experts in water, climate, and birds and bird conservation, trying to have those collaborative conversations that we hope can be productive. Inaction is not an option. And unless one is content to wait for a massive train wreck. For example, the long dry Owens Lake in California became a source of massive dust storms, which caused human health problems in California's urban areas. Ultimately, litigation and clean air laws forced the Los Angeles Department of Water to explore ways to dampen the dust, including putting water back on the land, as shown at the right. Similar issues are being dealt with today as we speak at the Salton Sea and will undoubtedly arise at Great Salt Lake and wherever there are dry lakes and playas as sources of windborne dust that can travel long distances. Not incidentally, when water was returned to Owens Lake, after a century of absence, the birds returned almost immediately. The Colorado River crisis is prompting much debate and pressure to reduce water use by agriculture in order to accommodate urban needs. In another setting, California's Central Valley, shown here, the possibility of having to give up water to satisfy urban and other needs, including endangered salmon in the Sacramento River, prompted rice growers to work with conservationists to better manage their water so they could continue to grow rice while adjusting management practices to be more friendly. If nothing else, this demonstrates the kind of creative solutions that can come from collaborative conversations. Water resources are going to be more and more intensively managed. From the standpoint of bird conservation, our challenge is to maintain ecologically functional networks of lakes and wetlands with some semblance of normal variation. One implication is that the large water bodies we cherish as part of our landscapes may look different in the future as the emphasis shifts to management of smaller units and to maintain ecological functionality. And if you look at proposals for the Salton Sea in the future, that's exactly where it's headed. Along with intensive management, better monitoring of water use is critical, as is enforcement of laws and regulations about water rights and use and storage of surface and groundwater. Two final points. From an avian standpoint, maintaining a functional network of lakes and wetlands must be tackled at a regional scale. Birds will never thrive, much less survive, without addressing the larger ecosystem. The recent legislation for a USGS regional assessment of saline lakes is a key step in the direction of a regional approach. In the end, maintaining a functional network will require a coordinated, comprehensive approach on the scale of the Western Sage-Grouse Initiative, or perhaps on the scale of long-term, large-scale restoration programs, such as for the Florida Everglades. Second, though, the flip side of the need for a regional approach is this. Although the water bodies in question across the Intermountain West all face similar threats, such as reduced snowpack and increased evaporation, the solutions also need to be local. Every water body has its own story and particular blend of ownerships, land uses, laws and regulations, threats and opportunities. Notwithstanding the commonalities, each place is unique. Our hope is that there can be a regional framework that provides resources and guidance to inform and support substantive local initiatives at places like Abert. In the final analysis, Lake Abert is priceless in its own right, and it is also priceless as part of regional, national, and international networks that support millions and millions of migratory birds. The solution for Lake Abert must be local. The solution for the network must be regional. So thank you, and if there's time for questions, we'll try and respond.
Thanks, Dan. You've actually used your time, so but we'll have a break after the next talk. So please hold your questions to then. There'll be a 10-minute break, and we can use that for questions. Thanks, Dan. Really, really good. The next speaker is David Herbst, who's been a research scientist and still is at the University of California, Sierra Nevada Aquatic Research Laboratory in Mammoth Lakes on the east side of the Sierra. And that's connected with the UC Santa Barbara and Santa Cruz. His studies have specialized on the algae and invertebrates that constitute the foundations of the food chains in inland aquatic systems such as Lake Abert. You can see the title of Dave's talk there, Invertebrate Productivity in Hypersaline Lakes. The floor is yours, Dave. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Theo. Is my microphone on?
Yes. All good.
Oh, it is. Okay, great.
Yep, everything's good.
Okay, so I'm going to give you a closer look into kind of the productivity and mechanics of what happens in saline lakes. the habitats that are there, the effects of salinity, and I'm going to focus my talk for the most part on the benthic invertebrates, the alkali fly and other brine flies in particular. And so they really are the group of organisms, that are most important as food sources to the birds that come to the lake. And so in the left couple of illustrations you see here is the larva, pupa, and adult stages of the alkali fly, brine shrimp in the lower right-hand corner. So these, as far as hypersaline lake ecosystems go, these are the primary players in the food resources that become super abundant and available to birds. And a big part of that is just how contagious their distributions are, how packed they are, and the high densities they are. And Ron's already shown some good slides of that. The upper right-hand picture here is from Lake Abert, and what you see right along the rocky shoreline there are the big concentrations of adult flies, and to their left, in a big pile, are what are called the windrows of pupae that can wash up at that lake. So tremendously abundant flies, both in the adult stage and in the pupa stage, that in fact, when they are super abundant, can be cast into the shore, where even though there's very high productivity in the lake, there can be a pretty high source of mortality that occurs when they get washed into the lake shore like that. Either they become dried out, they become accessible as a food resource to birds. That's one other way that birds can get a food resource from the alkali flies. But at very high densities, they're also subject to parasitism by a parasitoid wasp that will lay its eggs in the pupae, and instead of flies emerging, there'll be tiny wasps that emerge. Oops. So the really important habitat feature that unites these populations and the kinds of ecological setting that they need is this shallow littoral region in the nearshore margins of the lake. This is where most of the productivity goes on in the benthic community. So you can see in these photographs on the left, these are the tufa limestone rock substrates that you see occurring at Mono Lake and many other lakes, including the tufa deposits that you find on rocks along the shores of Abert. And then in this middle photograph at the bottom, you see some of the microbialites, which is another type of rock form that's really prominent in the Great Salt Lake, and also a really important substrate on which the flies can attach themselves. And so this rocky intertidal kind of habitat that develops in the shallow littoral zone of salt lakes is a really important environment, because it's where they'll seek out protection from wave action. And that's a really crucial thing to avoid the kinds of mortality that I was talking about that you see in that, the potential for that in that upper right-hand photograph, again from Lake Abert. And in the bottom right there, you see that that rock substrate is not only important for alkali flies and for the attachment of the pupa stage in particular, but it's where you see a lot of the algae growing and attaching that is the substrate on which the flies feed. So that shallow rocky littoral environment, very important both for protection by the larvae and pupae of the flies, but also really an important substrate on which the algae is going to grow. And in this case, what you're looking at is the green Tinocladus that can grow in great abundance at low to moderate salinities, not at high salinities. But it's also a substrate on which you'll find the growth of other algae like diatoms that can become very productive in saline lakes at moderate salinity again, and is a really important food resource for the fly larvae and for the adults as well. And this gives you some idea of at Lake Abert, a photograph from Ron Larson that shows the distribution of these rocky substrates at a relatively low lake level at 42, 48 feet surface elevation. And so what you can see here is a decline in the availability of that rocky substrate as you go out into the lake. So there can be some erosion at the lake margins by wave action that provides some mechanics for uncovering some of the buried substrates that might be there. But you can also see that there's less of that kind of habitat that's available at these low lake levels. So one of the first important things about the ecological setting of both Abert and these other saline lakes is that as the lake levels drop, the availability of this protective rocky intertidal habitat is really becoming diminished. So again, to set a little bit more of the ecological setting of saline lakes, there's relatively few organisms that can inhabit the high salinity environments. So there's this great decline in diversity as you go from low salinity environments to higher salinity environments. So this is a graph that comes from a study at Owens Lake, where we're fortunate enough now to have a real mix of habitat types there, in large part owing to the fact that not only are there still some marginal springs that seep into the nearshore lake environment there, but the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power has been required to rehydrate parts of the lake to protect from the dust storms that Stan was talking about. So because there's this matrix of different kinds of saline habitats that are there, this mosaic of habitats, you get many environments that are at the low salinity end and environments that are at the high salinity end. So if we look within this for context, and this is really what you see across the board, not just in Owens Lake, but across the number of saline lake habitats and subsaline environments that you find throughout the Great Basin. You find the highest levels of diversity at low salinities, and as you increase that salinity range, you can see many of these taxa drop out, and it's because they're simply not tolerant of those moderate to high salinity ranges. Only a few species can survive as you get into that hypersaline range. So that's another important aspect of the ecological setting, is that there's a lot of diversity of community diversity. And again, these are all benthic organisms, bottom-dwelling organisms at the low salinity. And it includes not only these organisms that can be fairly productive at high salinity, that thrive in these environments where there's high salt, but and indeed are primarily grazers. They're feeding on the algae that grows in the lake. But under these low salinity conditions, there's a mix of organisms that would be competitors on those organisms or predators on those organisms. But fundamental to the larval physiology of flies is osmoregulation. And Sue mentioned the importance of osmoregulation in birds. It's really important in the flies and the shrimp as well. So to get into the weeds a little bit on this, what you're looking at on the y-axis is what the internal osmotic concentration might be in an organism relative to the x-axis, the external osmotic concentration. So in other words, the concentration of salts in the lake itself. And so just above that x-axis, you can see what the equivalent concentration would be in grams per liter. So seawater is at about 1,000 milliosmolar, and up to 150 grams per liter is about equivalent to 5,000 milliosmolar. This varies a little bit depending on the kind of chemical concentration that's there. But if an organism were to basically be an osmotic conformer, its blood concentration would run along that dashed blue line. In other words, its blood concentration internally would be the same as what the concentration is externally. There's very few organisms that are osmoconformers, except those that live in marine environments, which for the most part are osmoconformers, but don't live in an environment where there's necessarily a lot of variability in the concentration of salts. But in the alkali fly larvae, what you can see here for starters is that they have a ability to control the concentration of osmotic solutes in their blood at a relatively low level, at actually about the same level that we find in our own blood, so somewhere in the range of 300 to 400 milliosmolar. And so to do this, they have to spend a lot of energy using membrane enzyme pumps that are embedded in certain types of specialized cells, and those are used to pump out the salts that they would be drinking in while they're living in the lake, while they're feeding on algae and imbibing water at the same time they're feeding. So they have to have some way to get rid of those salts to maintain this constant level of osmotic concentration. And so the gradient between what their blood concentration is and what the external concentration is, the difference between this and this, the higher that gets, the more expensive it is for them to live in that. So this isoosmotic condition right here, where the external meets the internal, that would be where the minimum osmotic cost for osmoregulation is. Interestingly, not only does the alkali fly do this, but the brine fly that lives at Great Salt Lake also does this, but they do so at a much higher concentration of their internal salt. So the osmotic gradient between their blood concentration and what would the external concentration be were they to be osmoconformers is much less. And so it's less expensive for them to live in high salinity water, which is why they have a higher tolerance for salinity than does the alkali fly. The salt fly at Great Salt Lake primarily is living only in chloride-dominated water, whereas the alkali fly lives in carbonate bicarbonate water that is a more complex mix of anions of chloride, bicarbonate, carbonate, and sulfates, and so they maintain a lower hemolymphosmotic concentration and so are less tolerant of high salinity because the gradient between internal and external is much greater than it is for the Salt Lake fly. So don't get flies confused. There's a couple of different species here, and they live in different kinds of water chemistry and have differing sorts of salt tolerance that are associated with their particular physiology. So that's really an important context for understanding that there's a cost associated with living in saline water because of this necessity for them to be osmoregulators in order to survive and be metabolically viable. So what are the consequences of that? So what I'm going to show you now are a series of graphs that show for the alkali fly, what are the consequences of that osmotic cost of osmoregulation. And so this upper left figure shows the development time of third instar larvae. This is what a third instar larva would look like over a range of salinities from 10 grams per liter, which is about isoosmotic, up to 150 grams per liter. And so in these experiments, you can see that the time for development takes longer and longer as salinity goes up because growth rates are slower in those organisms. You might think that with that slower growth rate, that might compensate for their ultimately what size they are able to achieve when they form the pupa stage, but that's not the case. Over the same salinity range in this same experiment, you can see that the size of pupae, which are illustrated here, also decreases. And where this dashed line is about where it corresponds to the point at which flies are no longer able to very successfully emerge from these smaller pupae, which is shown in this lower panel on the left here. For adult fly emergence, you can see below this 1.7 millimeter width right about here, the success of adult emergence dramatically declines. And those flies which are able to emerge from these smaller pupae are themselves much smaller. And in the final panel over here in the lower right-hand corner, it shows you what the consequences for that for body size here along the x-axis for the number of eggs they're able to produce. And this is the Abert population in green over here and the mono lake population in blue over here. So it shows you that as body size declines, so does the reproductive capacity in terms of the number of eggs that you see these smaller adult flies being able to lay. And again, not only is size a limitation on the number of eggs, but just the success, the number of flies that are able to survive and emerge becomes much smaller as the body size decreases. So again, slower growth, smaller size, fewer emerging, and fewer eggs being laid as a consequence of that cost of osmoregulation. And so this leads to trying to frame these physiological processes and these ecological settings into a model to try and explain what the abundance of what's the sweet spot for the abundance of organisms like the alkali fly and even the Great Salt Lake brine fly. So this is the intermediate salinity hypothesis, which posits that the optimum for that is going to be at these intermediate salinities, and that it may shift depending on the relative salt tolerance of organisms. But at the low end of this salt gradient, the limitations are really associated with interactions with a more diverse community of organisms. Predators and competitor organisms will exclude the capacity of the flies to be able to survive under these conditions. And even in some circumstances, you might find fish surviving at lower salinities, and those are certainly going to be depredating on things like the vulnerable alkali flies. Whereas at the high end of the salinity gradient, it's going to be limitations due to the physiological stress of increasing salinity and that cost of osmoregulation, which I just explained. And so when we look at some direct observations of what that salinity gradient might look at, again, we're looking for an optimum right there in the middle. And by looking at a series of observations over time, you can see that it basically conforms to that at low, moderate, and high salinity levels that correspond to 20 to 30 grams per liter at Abert, 75 to 90 grams per liter, and 180 grams per liter under different years, different kinds of salinity conditions. You can see it does about that. There's this sweet spot at the intermediate levels of salinity, the population is going to be most productive. And so going back to something I think I heard Stan say, you also don't see as many shorebirds at the lower end of the salinity gradient, and that's probably because these super abundant saline tolerant organisms also don't do as well in these more diverse community settings that are existing under these lower sets of salinities. And this is what you might see if you try to model what that set of productivities and community types might look like over the range of salinities that we have records for, at lake levels for, I should say, at Abert. So here's the decibel era when the lake was periodically dry. This is lake level we're seeing along here, this graphic. And then the colors correspond to these different conditions of what the community would look like in terms of overall diversity, but also productivity of organisms like the alkali fly. So the green, again, is this range. This is the sweet spot for productivity here, this range of lake levels between 4250 and 4258. This is also where you're going to find the most of the rocky habitat that is the best protective environment in that rocky littoral shallow water zone that provides habitat for the alkali flies. You get into this light red and red region, you basically are going to see great inhibition, not only of the growth of the flies because of the cost of osmoregulation and the limitations on their growth and reproductive capacity, but that's also a range of salinity where Ctenocladus, diatoms, other benthic algae that would otherwise be their food resources are also tremendously depleted. Now, there's been some question about what the history has been of lake level at Abert. And so I wanted to bring up some other data that I recently tried to answer this question for myself. We only have records that go back to 1926 for what the lake level would have been like at Abert. So what's the regularity with which we might expect in the pre-settlement history of the Chewaucan Basin Abert to have been going through periods of dryness like we saw both during the Dust Bowl and more recently? Well, you can actually use tree ring data, dendrochronology, to try and reconstruct what some of those records might be. So there's good dendrochronology records that I was able to find from tree rings between 1705 and 1979. And given that we have good records for lake level between 1926 and 1979, we can run correlations between those tree ring records and the lake surface elevation to get some idea of what that relationship might be. The relationship is really quite tight down here at the lower end of the range, so tree ring data is very good at predicting when lake levels would be low. It becomes uncoupled as you get up into the higher range of the relationship between lake level and tree rings, and that's because basically as water becomes super abundant, tree growth is no longer dependent just on water availability, but on nutrients and other soil conditions. So there's going to be a slight uncoupling here. But what we're really interested in, though, are these low narrow tree rings and their association, close correlation with low lake levels at Abert, which below about 42, 48 are really importantly diminished. So let's take that correlation now and look at where there might be historic conditions dating back to 1709, where there could have been dry phases. And again, we're looking at this below the 280 millimeter range, which is around 11, I think, inches per year. You can see the Dust Bowl area really stands out here, so it's very clear that that was a period that was associated also with these narrow tree ring records. Then we got a couple of pulses of what we'd expect to be higher lake levels, and indeed there is an alignment between these bumps here in wider tree rings and more potential for associated correlated precipitation at that time. If we look back in the record, all the way back to 1709, we don't really see very many comparable records. The potential dryness might have existed back here in the 1830s and the 1840s, but again, remember that the Dust Bowl era involved this relatively long period of low precipitation. There's a couple of other periods where it drops below 280. These earlier short phases, probably unlikely to cause drying. So my conclusion from this would be that there's really a relatively low likelihood of there having been consistent drying of the lake prior to pre-settlement. So try and summarize a lot of this information and look at what the effects are of salinity and the supply of energy and the demands on energy. Basically, there's less food supply because algae growth is inhibited. There's less habitat because rocky habitat starts to become unavailable at low lake levels. And there's major energy demands that are associated with osmoregulation. So if waters are diverted, it's going to result in lower lake levels, reduction of benthic substrate area, and habitat availability. Those water diversions are also going to result in increased salinity, which reduces the growth rates of algae. And those two things combined, both the cost of osmoregulation and the reduced supply, increased demand, reduced supply, are going to result in reduced rates of larval survival and development, smaller size of pupae in adults, reduced reproductive success, all of which results in demographic limitations on population productivity.
Dave, you about to wrap up, Dave? You just have a couple of minutes.
That's fine. I'm going to wrap up right now. I just want a couple of other things. We began looking at the two really important players, flies and shrimp. So brine shrimp are also osmoregulators, and studies at both Mona Lake and Great Salt Lake show that they also suffer the same consequences in reduced growth, reduced size, reduced reproductive capacity as salinity increases. Now, you might want to look at short-term bioassays that are typically called lethal concentration at which 50% of the population dies. Now, these are bioassays that are typically done to ascertain whether or not something is really toxic, but they're meaningless to the actual capacity for population productivity. So I would say don't pay very much attention to what LC50s tell you, because you can get brief survival at high salinity, but it doesn't indicate that there's actually going to be adaptation occurring in those high salinity conditions. And then finally, there is still life in high salinity conditions, but it's cyanobacteria and some archaea that survive. But mostly hypersaline lakes are so they're not lifeless, but they are basically still lacking in eukaryotic life forms. So sorry if I went and spoke very fast, but that's as much as I'll say.
Thank you, Dave. Thanks very much. Okay, so we're running a little bit late, but so I think we can adjust the schedule and start with the second batch of talks at 2:45. We've heard about the biology. Now we're going to the description of the ecosystem and its various components. After this break and question time, discussion period, we'll hear about what the projections are. We've already heard about climate change. We've heard about the worries of the dryness that we're all experiencing and warming. And then we'll also hear about more about this issue that Dave was just talking about, the past and the distant past from paleo studies. But let's go to questions then. So if we can go back, there was a question earlier, I think for Stan. Bob Hughes, do you want to ask a question? You can unmute yourself.
Yeah, I just wanted to know if there's any thinking about how the recent waters of the US regulation is going to impact these wetlands.
I don't think if that's directed to me, this is Stan. I don't think I can give you a good reply to that. My understanding is that those regulations are relating primarily to ephemeral, wetlands and the like on private land. And I don't know how much of that habitat is really upstream from Lake Abert. So I guess I have to punt on that one.
My take on that, Bob, would be that most of these hypersaline habitats in their natural state are still perennial habitats. And so as perennial habitats and with connectivity with inflowing waters, they still represent that significant nexus that's at the core of WOTUS.
Thank you. There are various posts in the chat that you can look at. There's a question from Michael Parker. let's get to that in a sec about water withdrawals. Are there specific questions for Dave's talk on the invertebrates? Okay, they might come up now. Mike Parker, do you want to ask that your question?
Yeah, it seems like there's an 800-pound gorilla in the room, and Dave's graph or flow chart was the first to show a box that said irrigation withdrawals or water withdrawals. And it seems like that's a huge part of this whole equation, why these wetlands and lakes are drying up. And I was just wondering if we're tracking those data, if we know how water use has changed, if irrigation methods are being proposed to be more conservative. It just seems like a huge part of this whole equation.
Yes, the fact is that there are no reported measurements, there are no required measurements. It does exist in Idaho. There have been attempts to legislate water diversion measurements and reporting in Oregon that have not been well received, haven't gone anywhere. So we don't know. There are big questions about the hydrology in the Chewaucan. So it's tremendously important, and we do need to figure it out. I don't know that there's a ready source of validated information. I would call on the Oregon Water Resources Department to prepare a list of the diversion of the diversion history as it's been. There have been some measurements, no doubt, but also the water rights over period to see what the fact is. That data to people who are not very familiar is hard to interpret. It's like trying to read legalese. So I would really call on the Oregon Water Resources Department to put together a compilation, because I think it would really help everybody here. Would somebody else like to chime into that on that point?
I would just say that there's, I think, pretty broad agreement amongst folks that have been doing research on Abert for, well, a long time or a short time, that we really are lacking in the kind of information that we need to develop an accurate hydrologic budget for the lake that accounts for what kinds of diversions occur upstream, what the flows are in the Chewaucan River, both above and below the marshes and above Abert, to an accurate gauging of how much water is flowing into Abert and what the consequences are of the River's End Ranch impoundment that is upstream of the lake. So we need to try and account for all that to get a very accurate model in order to be able to decide what the best way might be of distributing water.
Any other questions directed at any of the first session speakers? Interested about birds? Interested about those Stenocladus algae? Those flies? What do they taste like, Dave? You roasted any of them?
I have indeed. They have sort of a buttery, salty flavor, as you might not be too surprised. So kind of like the corn nuts or salted nuts that you'd find at a pub.
Some people think we might be eating more of those insects in the future.
We'll come to that. But we got to adjust the salinity so it's just right.
Yeah. Okay. We will proceed in just a couple of minutes. Any other questions, discussion?
I have a lake chemistry question. This is Adam Hudson. A lot of what I have been radiocarbon dating on the shorelines is calcium carbonate. And so I'm curious, it seems to form in that kind of rocky littoral shore zone, both today and in the past. And does anyone have any idea what organisms are responsible for mediating its precipitation and at what salinity levels that happens?
Oh, thank you for that question, Adam. Yeah, really interestingly, the alkali fly larvae, the primary mechanism they have for getting rid of carbonate and bicarbonate is a specialized modification of what are called the Malpighian tubules, which are essentially the insect equivalent of kidneys, and they usually operate in the same way that kidneys do, doing nitrogenous waste. But in this case, one pair of the Malpighian tubules and the alkali fly larvae are modified to basically form calcium carbonate microspheres that are a result of them pumping calcium into the lumen of those tubules, which then, when carbonate or bicarbonate passively get into those tubules, precipitates. And they accumulate the contents of those Malpighian tubules until they pupate, which they do so by attaching themselves to rocks, which is why I say that rocky intertidal is so important. And they discharge the contents of those tubules when they do so, and it then becomes cemented to the surface of the rock. So one important way that calcium carbonate is forming on the surface of those rocks is this osmoregulatory excretory product, if you will, of the Malpighian tubules. There's probably a role that algae play in it as well, much like you'd find with coral, but there is probably also shallow freshwater seepage that's difficult to see because it might not be a spring source, and that can then, chemically form calcium carbonate in a lake with high carbonate and high pH in it, like Abert or Mono Lake, which is the primary way that tufa towers form at Mono Lake.
All right, thank you. I think we're ready to proceed. So I'd like to introduce Larry O'Neill. Larry is an associate professor at Oregon State University in the College of Earth, Ocean and Atmospheric Sciences. He serves as the director of the Oregon Climate Service and as the Oregon State Climatologist. And he's going to tell us about climate predictions for Southeast Oregon and future scenarios for the Lake Abert watershed. Thank you, Larry.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for the opportunity to come speak with you. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about both the climate projections for Southern Oregon and the Oregon closed basins and Lake Abert watersheds. And I also want to give just a slight perspective about our current drought period that we're in. So we've been in, Oregon in general has been in a prolonged drought period since about the year 2000. And I wanted to just give a little bit of perspective about how those conditions face up historically. So the key points I'm going to get to today is that currently in this part of Oregon and the Oregon closed basins watershed, the current drought ranks among the 3 worst in state recorded history. And so this is over the last 3 years. And so it's really been kind of an exceptional time period. And the key drivers of this drought severity obviously include high temperatures, which has fueled very high evaporative demand, and also more intermittent and less snowpack. And of course, lower precipitation as well. And so the projections for the upcoming 21st century from our climate model simulations essentially indicate that the region is going to experience much higher evaporative demand, even though there might be slight increases in precipitation during winter, but those the higher evaporative demand will cancel all that out. And there'll be, as was alluded to in an earlier talk, the winter snowpack faces a really precipitous decline all throughout the US West, but particularly in this part of Oregon as well, in the peaks surrounding the Lake Abert and the basin. And finally, a really interesting consequence of both of these is that we anticipate that there'll be higher peak stream flows during winter and much lower base flows during summer. And so the character of our water supply will change in the basin much more. So as first promised, I want to put just the current drought cycle into perspective. And so over the last 3 years, we've run a very large precipitation deficit all across the Pacific Northwest, but much more so in the leeward side of the Cascades in both Oregon and Washington. And this map just shows the percent of annual precipitation that we've deficit that we've accrued over the last 3 years. And so there's the Lake Abert watershed and then the Oregon closed basins. And essentially, much of this region has missed out on almost a year's worth of precipitation over the last 3 years. And in fact, the Oregon closed basins, 5% of the area is missing a full year's precipitation. And in Lake Abert, about 8% is missing a full year's worth of precipitation. So this really kind of underscores some of the challenges for water supply that we've had that's become obvious in these talks. So how does precipitation vary historically? So I just took the Oregon Closed Basin watershed and averaged the amount of precipitation. So this just shows the precipitation anomaly going back to 1895 until 2022. And so this is annual precipitation. And in 16 out of the last 22 years, so going back to about the year 2000, Oregon is, the Oregon closed basins have been below average in 16 out of those 24 years. So we've really been accruing some long-term precipitation deficits, and we haven't had as many years between dry periods where we've been able to recharge the water supply system here. So we've been just accruing precipitation deficits. So the other dry period that this is analogous to, obviously, is back to the 1920s and 1930s, where there was probably less precipitation during that time. Although it should be noted that observations here were much more uncertain within this basin due to the fact that there's hardly any precipitation measurements there. But one thing we could see is that we've definitely been more drier than at any point since the 1940s and 1930s. A very interesting paper came out recently that looked at tree ring data and tried to reconstruct soil moisture anomalies going back to 800 CE. And they're trying to rank drought periods within that time. And the current drought period that we're in all throughout the US West between 2000 and 2021 ranks as one of the most driest times in that period. And within Southeast Oregon, Southern and Southeast Oregon, this has been one of the top 5 to 10 driest periods going back to 21-year periods going back to 800 CE. So this has really been one of the driest periods, an exceptionally dry period in the last 1,200 years, and nearly as dry as much of the US Southwest, the Four Corners states that we often hear so much more about in the Colorado River Basin. Another nice aspect of the study is they tried to look at how anthropogenic climate change contributed to the dryness of this drought, and it suggested that that climate change made the drought 17% worse than it was. The soil was 17% drier because of anthropogenic climate change than it would have been otherwise. So that was a very interesting assessment as well, to look at the role of human-induced climate change versus natural variability in the system. Now, if you look at a history of drought within the Oregon closed basins, one of the key drought metrics that we use to monitor drought around the US West, and particularly in Oregon, is what's called the Standardized Precipitation Evaporation Index. And it essentially incorporates the water supply from precipitation with the water demand from evaporation. And it gives us a good way to rank different years and different areas with each other. And so this is just kind of a yearly time series of this drought metric, and going all the way back to 1895. So, and this is for the Oregon Closed Basins watershed. And the last 3 years, we've been in some sort of either moderate to severe drought in the area. And most other year, since 2000, all but 6 years, we've been in at least below average in this drought index here. And so this drought period is actually quite, so this drought metric, what's really nice thing about it is it includes the effect of temperature on evaporation. So it doesn't just include precipitation variability. And this drought metric also correlates very well with soil moisture and stream flow conditions. So it's a good indicator of hydrological droughts and some of the other droughts that can result from that here. Excuse me. But one thing to really notice, though, is that even though the drought has been pretty bad in the last couple of years, it has not been historically the worst. So you go back to the early 90s and into the 1920s and 1930s, and this region has probably experienced worse, 12-month drought periods here. Now, if you go out to 36 months, so use this drought metric to go out 36 months, this will show that that this drought was actually one of the 3 longest. And one of the main contributors to it is just its longevity. So we've just had 3 years of below average precipitation, higher evaporation, And this has contributed, if you look at all such 3-year periods going back in the historical data record, this drought is comparable to the droughts in the early 90s and in the mid 30s as well. Now, if we look at, just kind of go on now, instead of looking at the historical conditions, now we start to look at what the climate models are projecting here. And so I'm going to show us a series of figures, time series of projections. And these are based off of 20 climate model simulations that are averaged together. And then I pulled this data out for the Lake Abert watershed area. So it should be highly relevant to our discussions here. And the first one is just the annual average precipitation from the climate model projections. And for the climate model projections, there are 2 emission scenarios that are considered. One is what we call the RCP 4.5, which is essentially that we have a moderate mitigation of emissions after about 2040. And so it gives kind of a little bit more realistic scenario that we're hoping to follow. The worst case scenario is what's called RCP 8.5, and it essentially assumes no emissions reductions to the end of the century, and that we steadily increase our greenhouse gas concentrations. And so in these figures, the red will be the RCP 8.5. So this is the worst, the worst case scenario. And then the blue is the RCP 4.5, which is the more realistic scenario here. And in either scenario, the climate models kind of agree that we're only going to experience a very small increase in precipitation. So, which is good news. It's not going to fall off a cliff or anything. So basically, the annual precipitation is not expected to change significantly going to the end of the century. And I should mention that the time series here goes out to 2100, and then it starts at the left here at 1950, where the climate models were run in a historical simulation mode here. So, but if you look at the numbers, RCP 4.5 projects about 3.9% more precipitation annually in the Lake Abert watershed, while RCP 8.5 projects about 7.5% more. Now, this nearly all the increase in the annual precipitations projected to occur during the winter months. So this just shows the same figure except for December, January, and February. And so most of the increase the slight increases that we saw there will occur during the winter months. And then if we look at the summer, June, July, and August, there's no significant change in the projected summertime precipitation as well from the climate models. So that, in some way, that's good news. Now, on the other side of the ledger is our water loss from evapotranspiration. And we've been talking quite a bit about that today from some of the other talks. And essentially, we're not going to get any more input from water from precipitation, but we're going to lose a lot more to evapotranspiration. And so the climate models are suggesting that annual evaporative water losses are expected to increase by about 15 to 30% by the end of the century. So this essentially means that precipitation will not go as far as to meet the needs of society or the lakes in here. And I should also note that these projected increases in evapotranspiration are noted during all seasons. So it's not just concentrated in the summer as well. The other thing to note here is that at least for the 2 emission scenarios, there is a big difference between whether we follow the moderate mitigation scenario, the RCP 4.5, and the no mitigation scenario of RCP 8.5. So if you want, you want to know about, how much benefit we'll get from, actually mitigating our emissions, this is actually a very good way of knowing that we can make a really good difference if we get on that. Now, a lot of this, or most of these increase in evapotranspiration is driven by the increase in mean temperature in the basin and throughout the US West in general, really. So the annual average temperature is expected to rise between 5.5 degrees Fahrenheit and 9.9 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of the century. So the moderate mitigation scenario is the 5.5 degrees Fahrenheit number, and the high emission scenario is 9.9. So we could get about 4 to 4.5 degrees Fahrenheit if we can mitigate our emissions here. But one of the big things for us is that this is the primary driver of increased evapotranspiration, and so this is how it'll really significantly influence our water supply into the future. Another measure of the kind of the thirstiness of the atmosphere, if you want to kind of colloquially, is what's called the vapor pressure deficit. And so this is just a amount, it's related to the amount of moisture that can evaporate into the air. And vapor pressure deficits are expected to grow very significantly out into the future. And not only does it increase, does this drive increased evapotranspiration and drier soils, but also contributes to increased wildfire risk and a whole host of adverse ecological changes in the basin. So this is kind of really a very concerning trend as well, this increase in the vapor pressure deficit in the atmosphere. And it also suggests that as the climate warms, we're not going to get a whole bunch more water vapor in the air that'll keep evapotranspiration down. So the air will just get a little bit drier as we go into the future. And finally, there was a talk earlier that did quotes, or it did talk about the decrease in snowpack throughout the US West. And this is a map that kind of shows this for the projected change in what we call the snow water equivalent, or the amount of water that's locked up in the snowpack on April 1st. So most of the US West are snowpack peaks historically somewhere around April 1st, with a few weeks before and after, depending on location. And so this map just shows the percent change in April 1st snow water equivalent from the lower emissions RCP 4.5 scenario, and this is for mid-century, so 2040 to 2069. And this time period is this 30-year period is fast approaching. And so this percentage is relative to the late 20th century mean from 1970 to 2000. And for a lot of the Southern Oregon and a lot of the Oregon basins in general, the snowpack is projected to decline by about 50 to 80%, depending exactly where you're at from here. And so this means that a lot of the precipitation we're getting during the winter time, instead of falling as snow, is now going to fall as rain. And we're going to have rain more projected to get more rain on snow events. And our wet snow that is coming around is projected to melt off earlier in the year. Now, if we go to RCP 8.5, these changes are even more stark. And so in many places we don't expect there to be little to no snowpack on April 1st, and which is a very worrying trend all across Oregon and the US West here. And finally, I wanted to end here on what this means for our water supply. And what I've shown is a series of what we call hydrographs. And so this is just the amount of water in a stream on the y-axis in cubic feet per second. And then this is just a water year beginning in October and ending in September. And so this just shows an annual average, or an average further into the century from 2040 to 2069. And I couldn't get a hydrograph for the Chewaucan River or anything close by, but the closest one I could get it for now is at the Rogue River at Lost Creek. And I should mention that a lot of these hydrographs around Oregon look similar. They'll exhibit similar responses to the changing precipitation and temperature patterns. So I'll just go ahead and show here. So this black curve shows historical conditions. And so it shows higher flow during the wintertime, and then peak flows in the early spring when we get the snow melt here. So this is very common in snow melt dominated basins, or a basin with significant snow melt component. And what we see is in the two emission scenarios, so they're both very similar. So it's either the orange or the blue curve here. These hydrographs actually shift further into the wintertime. So we get higher peak flows during the winter. And then we don't get this big snowmelt pulse in the springtime. And then once we get to the summertime, we get much lower base flows compared to historical here. So this is basically the key point here is that summer stream flows are projected to decline precipitously. And so there'll be less water available when it is needed the most in the landscape. And if we go further out into the century, so 27 to 2099, there becomes a bigger difference between the two emission scenarios, such that the RCP 8.5 leads to even bigger peak flows during the wintertime, but the drop off during the spring is even larger than in the other emission scenarios. And so we basically will start to get our base flows, our lowest base flows in June and early July, when we used to have some of our biggest ones historically. So it's just, again, just shows you that the character of our water supply is going to completely change, especially in Eastern Oregon, coming out here. And finally, I want to end with some of the things that we could try to do to understand the problem better. And the one thing that is severely lacking in a lot of Eastern Oregon, but in particular in Southeast Oregon and in the closed basin, or the Oregon closed basins, watershed, and into Harney County and Malheur County, is that we hardly have any climate, weather and climate observations. And so this map here just shows the current distribution precipitation observations that we have. And so I want to thank Chris Daly at the PRISM Climate Group for giving me this map. And it just shows you how few observations we have of precipitation out in Eastern Oregon. And so, a lot of what we talk about with drought monitoring and trying to understand the role of weather and climate in driving changes in the landscape are really hampered by our lack of observations. And so one of the things that we're doing to try to help contribute to this effort is myself and Erica Fleishman, who will be talking next. We've convened a working group to enhance Oregon's water, weather, and climate monitoring effort in Oregon. And the backbone of this effort is to try to increase a number of AgriMet stations that are deployed around Oregon. So AgriMet is a US Bureau of Reclamation program that provides weather stations throughout Oregon, and they have a really cost-effective way of being able to sponsor deployment of these stations around Oregon. And so we've convened this working group to try to identify places to put in these stations, and then also try to coordinate efforts for funding these stations more. And a big area of concern will be in Southeast Oregon, is to try to really increase the density of doing that, so that we can get a better idea of understanding the causes of the changes that we're observing throughout Oregon. So this is just a quick summary. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Larry. We would have time for just one quick question. I noticed, Larry, in the snowpack map, you had some green pixels that seemed to be somewhere pretty close to Lake Abert. Do you happen to, or blue ones? Do you happen to know which those are?
These are low elevation sites that have very little snow to begin with. So and like I said, there is some nuance to the distribution of precipitation. So there'll be a little bit more winter precipitation out here. And so I think that, these lower elevation sites hardly get any snow to begin with, but, in some of the simulations, there is a little bit of snow, more snow in the wintertime there.
So not a big positive.
No.
From those.
Yeah. We really want the higher elevation sites where the deep snowpacks are.
All right. Okay. Thanks very much, Larry. We can have questions at the end, but I think at this point we should move forward. And Larry mentioned that the next speaker is Erica Fleishman. Welcome, Erica. Thanks for speaking. She's a professor in the same College of Earth, Ocean and Atmospheric Sciences, CEOS we call it, at Oregon State. And she's also the director of the Oregon Climate Change Research Institute. And so she will talk to us about the ecological responses to projected climate change in the northwestern Great Basin. Thanks, Erica.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure to talk with this group. I wish we were all in person. Any day that I am able to talk with people who care about the Great Basin is a good day. So thank you. This is Walker Lake. This is actually a photograph of Walker Lake, which blows my mind. And I think that as people have been talking about, the situation with a lot of the inland lakes or the terminal lakes in the Great Basin is fairly similar. One of the things that has contributed to Walker Lake still being alive and kicking, and I think what gives me hope in part for Lake Abert, is the fact that people care about some elements of the system, and that gets them acting. So in the early 90s, when there were loons on Walker Lake on a regular basis and people counted the loons, then Senator Harry Reid took an interest and became aware that the salinity was going up in Walker Lake, and that as a result, there would no longer be fish at some point in Walker Lake. And as a result of that, there would no longer be loons on Walker Lake. And he did not think that that was okay at all. And Harry Reid very much loved the desert, very much loved the Great Basin and the Mojave. And so he allowed some actions to get going. People are still working pretty hard to try to get water into Walker Lake. More than 100% of the upstream flow was allocated for a very long time. But I think that makes the point that people need to care, and people need political champions, people in places of power. I think also makes a really strong point about, for all of these lakes, what's happening both in the region and outside the region matters. So, many of us think about the Great Basin as being largely uninhabited, which is true. So on this map, the warmer colors indicate where more people are. You don't need, that's probably pretty easy to figure out. So we think of the region as not being very inhabited, but at the same time, there are still a lot of human demands for water and for other natural resources. And a lot of the things that are going on in the Great Basin tie to long-term land use. One of the things that I find encouraging is that although the persistent land uses in many cases definitely have strong ecological effects, they are more reversible than concrete. So it may take a long time to reverse certain things, but I think that overall it is an ecological bonus that there are relatively few people across most of the region. And I am going to put in a plug for this movie. No one is paying me to do this. This is a wonderful, wonderful movie, which now is available. You can stream it on various streaming services, not Netflix, but if you haven't seen Rewilding a Mountain, it's about recovery of Heart Mountain from land use, and it talks about the recovery of the riparian areas and a lot of the native species, and it's a really, really nice thing to see. So I'm going to talk about a couple other things going on ecologically across the Great Basin, across the northwestern Great Basin, that are related to climate change and that expand a little bit from what we've been talking about in some of the previous conversations. So one of the things, obviously, that people are focused on across the West is how climate change relates to wildfire. And so I live in Corvallis, and Western Oregon people are very focused on Western Oregon. They're focused on fires in recent years for very, very good reason. And they tend to talk a lot about, well, often people use in Western Oregon talk about fire synonymous with forest fire. And I think that actually is not uncommon across the country. So people think about, the big trees, and that's kind of the image they get, is trees on fire, and talking about debating about land management that may or may not affect fire dynamics. People tend to focus on trees. I love trees. At the same time, my worldview after working in the Great Basin for 30 years and really caring a lot about the place is trees that look a lot different. And it's areas that are sagebrush, shrub steppe, and areas that are pinyon and juniper woodlands. And obviously the fire dynamics in a lot of these areas are quite a bit different than what happens west of the Cascades. And if we look at fire perimeters across the past several decades, you get a sense here, if you look at the sort of the black hatched areas, where have the fires been? As people here are pretty familiar, most of them have not been in those heavily tree dominated they haven't been in Western Oregon with great big trees, although there have certainly been plenty of fires in areas with trees. And there are a fair number of fires, as all of you know, across central and southern Oregon. Okay, one big factor there that many of us are familiar with is cheatgrass. So cheatgrass is an evil plant, and most of us agree about that. What is associated with cheatgrass in terms of climate? A number of different factors. Lots of people have worked on trying to estimate associations of weather patterns and climate patterns with cheatgrass. Cheatgrass likes water. Cheatgrass establishes very well when there's high autumn and spring precipitation. And then percent cover and biomass tend to be associated with water a little bit later in the year, basically the peak water period. There's also a time lag. So if you have a wet winter, even if the next year is relatively dry, you still have a pretty strong response in terms of percent cover and biomass with cheatgrass. Other things going on with cheatgrass. A lot of good work is suggesting that right now, the highest germination and growth and reproduction are at sort of intermediate elevations. So think about, lower elevations in the mountains, or think about some of the relatively high valleys, areas that have moderate temperatures and have moderate water availability. Also, obviously, cheatgrass does very, very well with wildfire. It changes the wildfire dynamics across most of the Great Basin and the Intermountain West, so it's highly flammable. Areas where cheatgrass comes in tend to burn more frequently, and the areas tend to be larger as cheatgrass expands into a monoculture. Cheatgrass also does very, very well with livestock grazing, or with road blading, or with any type of ground disturbance. So if you have ground disturbance across much of the Intermountain West, and certainly in the Great Basin, leave that ground disturbed and don't have native plants established fairly readily, and it is a party for cheatgrass. However, cheatgrass, there are strong indications that cheatgrass is limited by high temperatures and low precipitation, and also that it is limited by low soil temperatures and by competition with especially native forbs and grasses. So that's kind of why it's at those intermediate elevations. Cheatgrass is present across a lot of the Great Basin at the highest elevations, but usually not dominant. It's hard for it to dominate there. Same thing with some of the very low elevations. Although you get other bad plants, non-native invasives at lower elevations. And I guess I should say my favorite description of a weed from a botany professor years ago was, a weed is just a plant growing somewhere where you don't want it to grow. So in cheatgrass's native range, I'm sure it is great. Okay, so what is projected to happen as climate changes in a lot of the directions that that Larry just described? So it's an interesting thing. If you look at just the presence of cheatgrass, look at areas where it's present right now, it actually is starting to become more abundant at higher elevations and in slopes with lower solar exposure. And so this suggests that as temperatures warm, as those soil temperatures increase, perhaps at some times of year as cloud cover increases, cheatgrass may expand upslope. It also is able to capitalize on some of the high winter and low spring precipitation, whereas the native plants tend to do better with, the native plants tend to germinate later than cheatgrass. So the native plants tend to do better with precipitation that's more skewed toward spring and not so much winter. So, there's a lot of uncertainty about the storm tracks and exactly when precipitation is going to fall across the region. That one's a little bit tricky. There have been some projections that some of the lower elevations where cheatgrass occurs now actually may become too hot and dry for cheatgrass in the future. On the one hand, that is promising if you want to get rid of cheatgrass. On the other hand, it's really difficult to replace cheatgrass with something else once it's become a monoculture. So what is going to come into those areas? What other types of non-native invasives might come into those areas? Uncertain. But cheatgrass, area across the Great Basin may be at somewhat stable, although the distribution may shift as climate changes. And I'm going to talk about some other birds a little bit and talk about habitat for some other birds. So I've been had the very good fortune to work on birds in the central and western Great Basin for about 20 years with lots of wonderful people. And it's kind of an interesting thing over that time, as it always does. Computational capacity has increased, statistical methods have evolved, and it's kind of a fun thing. People sometimes first come into our group and they say, I have this great statistical method and I can figure it out. And you say, I look forward to that. And then it doesn't always necessarily work out that way. So one of the things that I have really, really enjoyed about working in this region and working with the team I do is that we try really hard to incorporate both natural history and observation, and as one of my mentors said, going outside and looking with some of the advances in statistical methods and computing capacity that allow us to ask different questions of complicated data and of data on lots of different environmental factors. So one of the things that our group has been finding, and this is in canyons, in mountain ranges, in the central and western Great Basin, we have looked at riparian systems, which in a sense are closed systems too. I mean, they're only going to expand so much within a canyon environment, or there's only so much area that they can actually cover. And one of the things that we have found is that species richness of birds that are really tightly tied to riparian areas in these canyons seems to be associated with the amount of riparian area, but not necessarily the fragmentation of riparian area. So if you think about it as, is there a canyon with a whole bunch of riparian, it's okay if that riparian is fragmented from the standpoint of species richness of birds, but they like to have a lot of riparian around. So we're finding that that's a pretty strong signal. Something else that we are finding, which we really didn't expect, is that for species richness of riparian obligate birds in canyons in the mountains in the Great Basin, there seems to be a threshold amount of riparian area above which species richness is high and below which species richness is appreciably lower. And that's roughly 33. It's been roughly in the 30s to 50s hectares of riparian area. Why that amount, we don't know. But this threshold surprised the heck out of us. We were not really expecting to see any type of threshold response with birds. Okay, so what's going on with riparian areas? We have some evidence from our data over the past 20 years that some species of birds are moving downslope over time. They're moving, so the general thinking is that over the long term, animals and plants move to higher latitudes as it becomes warmer, and they move to higher elevations. And in some cases, a limited number of cases, but we're finding some evidence of birds moving downslope over time. So this makes no sense. However, many of us with some limited remote sensing data and also with our eyes, we suspect that the riparian is expanding in some areas in the central and western Great Basin. And so we're just starting to really examine this in a fair bit of detail, both on the ground and with remotely sensed data. Okay, why might riparian be expanding? One thing that is being hypothesized and to some extent being observed in different ecosystems across the country and around the world is that higher carbon dioxide benefits some plants, independent of the changes in temperature and precipitation and all of the things that are changing as a result of that higher carbon dioxide. But these plants may be benefiting just from the higher carbon dioxide. Reduction in grazing intensity, it's getting more difficult to grow a cow in a lot of these areas. And so, as has been seen in some parts of the Great Basin, simply the fact that there are, on the whole, fewer livestock in the region may be allowing some expansion of the riparian. Also, the vegetation in these areas, most of you are familiar with this, it doesn't grow all that quickly. When I moved to Oregon and I saw, certain large trees, and people would say, oh, there used to be a potato farm there. And I would say, what, like 100 years ago? And people looked at me and they said, no, 30 years ago. And it was sort of, oh my gosh, stuff grows really, really fast here. So stuff grows slower across the desert. And in some areas, the early 90s El Nino really, really scoured the heck out of these areas. A lot of streams were rerouted, scouring almost down to mineral layer soil in some places. So there still may be some really long-term activity or long-term recovery of the vegetation. So we have a lot of hypotheses about the mechanisms. We have hypotheses about just what is changing, and we're trying to examine that in more detail. This does not mean that if riparian is indeed expanding, it doesn't mean it's going to happen indefinitely. The Great Basin is a pretty tough region. The changes in temperature and precipitation up until now have been moderate. They may not be so moderate in the future, but I find this interesting. I find it somewhat hopeful. And just the fact that this region can change so much and support so many animals, so many plants, all of this, I think, is terrific. And I am hopeful that people will find creative solutions to make sure that the terminal lakes don't go belly up. So I will leave it there, and I am happy to talk with you. I see a question about documentation of reduction in grazing intensity in the Great Basin. The data on grazing in the Great Basin are terrible. They're really bad. So about the best that one can get, I'm sure there are a couple exceptions to this, is whether an allotment was active in a given year. Sometimes there are data on the animal unit months that were permitted for an allotment, but by and large, there are no records of what use actually was. So colleagues and I have used simply whether an allotment was active in a given year, made the assumption that we know has a lot of holes in it, if the allotment was active, it was grazed. And we've still found a really big signal in this case with cheatgrass, different measures of cheatgrass. The documentation across most of the Great Basin is much like what Larry showed of the documentation of ground observations of weather and climate across most of the Great Basin. It's pretty poor. Theo, you're muted.
Thanks. That wasn't very auspicious. Yeah. So on to the last speaker, and that is Adam Hudson, who's a research geologist at the Geosciences and Environmental Change Science Center of the USGS in Denver. And Adam is a geologist by training. He's been there since 2016. And he works on terminal or endorheic lakes across the Great Basin. Adam's talk is entitled Paleoclimate Effects on Tui chub Populations and Lake Levels in the Chewaucan Basin for the past 15,000 years. And before you start, Adam, I would say that we were trying to have a talk by a Native American tribal member, just weren't able to arrange that, unfortunately, because there have been people there over those thousands of years. And maybe we'll hear a bit about that. Thanks, Adam.
Absolutely, yeah. I'm really excited to be here to come and talk to you guys today. My talk is going to change gears a little bit, I think, but it's going to touch on a lot of things that we've talked about today. I am a geologist. I'm a geochemist. I've been working on the Paleo Lake Chewaucan in the Chewaucan Basin since 2013, so almost 10 years now. And you can see this is a place called the Sod Horn, this photo here. Now, are you able to see my thing, or do I have to find the pointer?
No, we can see the pointer, yes.
Okay, good, perfect. And so I think this is 2013, so I think there's a lake in there somewhere, but it was on the drying trend at that point. And but in the foreground here, you can see these shorelines, which are on the side of this hill of the Sod Horn, which is going to come into play here. And so I'm going to talk about lake level change in the Chewaucan Basin, what the geological record can tell us about how it has changed over the past 15,000 years, and kind of try to place some context on what climate conditions were like at key times in the past that led up to these changes in hydrology in the basin. And then take advantage of the fact that there is a world-renowned, world-class archaeological site called the Paisley Caves that is located just over the drainage divide here in the Summer Lake Basin that is full of fossil remains of this fish called the Tui chub, and talk a little bit about how their population and habitat preference has changed in response to changing lake level, and also what they can tell us about changing lake levels over the last 15,000 years. See, let's advance the slide. There we go. So while everyone else is looking at the beautiful lake or the birds or whatever, most of the time you're going to find me doing this, digging a hole in old lake deposits with my head down, looking for things in old shorelines or old lake deposits of various lakes in the Great Basin, trying to pull things out that I can take back to the laboratory and drill out something that I can use to date by mass spectrometry. And the whole point of this is to try to, for a known elevation of a past shoreline, place some age on it and use that as a constraint on how big the lake was at some time in the past. And by doing this over the entirety of the basin and a bunch of basins through the Great Basin, you can start to get an idea of periods of wetness and dryness across the Great Basin at the kind of 1,000-year time scale over the past 15,000 years. And the point of this, beyond just trying to understand the geologic history of the Great Basin, is to try to understand how modern conditions in Lake Abert compare to paleoclimate conditions in the past, some that were maybe wetter than what we're experiencing today, some that were maybe drier than what we're experiencing today, and maybe an analog for the future. And the question being, was Lake Abert more frequently like this? When I took this photo in 2013, there was a pretty substantial lake. Or is it more frequently like this? And when I took this photo in September 2015, which was one of the periods of dryness of the lake that we've heard much about today. And or sometimes the lakes are much bigger than anything that we've seen in the historical record. And there's been a lot of geological interest in this. And in fact, the very first USGS monograph ever published was on the shorelines that surround Lake Bonneville, which is located here, and the Great Salt Lake is the remnant of that one. But across the Great Basin, in nearly all of the playas in the internally drained basins of the Great Basin, there are these shorelines that ring the playas that attest to the fact that at times in the past, under very much different, much wetter climate conditions, there were mega lakes that existed across the Great Basin. And if we zoom into the northern basin and range here, here's Lake Chewaucan, here's Lake Abert, Summer Lake, and at the height of the high stand of this lake, the two lakes were joined, the marshes were filled, and we had a mega lake Chewaucan in there. And this star here, for reference, is the location of the Paisley Caves, which at that high stand level are pretty much right on the shoreline. And in addition to that, most of the other basins in the Northern Great Basin were deep at a similar time. And so this mega lakes part of the record is interesting, and it serves as a wet end member for the response of the lake basin to changes in climate. But it's kind of a no analog situation in terms of climate, mainly because the time when that occurred, things looked quite a bit different than they do today. We were in a global ice age. So if not at the most advanced stage, it was close to the most advanced stage of this large ice sheet that was over the Northern Hemisphere called the Laurentide ice sheet. And the effect of this ice sheet on global climate was great, particularly in the Northern Hemisphere. It made things much brighter in the Northern Hemisphere, which lowered solar input. It affected oceanic circulation, and it affected atmospheric circulation. And the effect of that was to direct more frequent winter storms, bringing a lot of moisture and cold conditions into the Great Basin, which maintains these really big lakes. And so if I just reveal the lake level hydrograph to you here, what you'll see plotted on this plot, and you'll see several of these through this talk. This is now 0 years before present. If we go right, we go back in time to 20,000 years before present. At the time here, when the Laurentide ice sheet was the greatest extent, which is shown here by percent glaciated area of North America, the lakes were relatively deep, kind of during the waning stages is when Lake Abert and Summer Lake came together to create Lake Chewaucan, which if we look at this zoomed in map here, creates a lake area shown out in this outline of gold. And then as the ice sheet continued to melt, lake levels, mean lake levels in the lake basin tend to go down over time. And by the time that the Laurentide ice sheet melted out, we're kind of in more of an analog climate for what we might consider to be typical for the Holocene, more similar to what we might see today. And so I'm going to focus some of my talk on comparing two time periods in this Holocene period, this kind of middle Holocene MH period between about 4,000 and 8,000 years before present, and then this late Holocene period, which is the last 4,000 years or so, which connects more or less to the present. And you'll notice from the hydrographs I've drawn here, which are based on a combination of geologic evidence, but a lot of it based on dating of shorelines, is that there was this inferred dry period in the middle Holocene, and then a range of lakes that were somewhat in the range that we know for historical variability for Summer Lake and Abert Lake in the last 4,000 years or so. And then segueing into the Paisley Caves, the time span of the Paisley Caves is somewhere fortuitously between this kind of 0 and 15,000 years before present, so that we can, if we have the right tool, compare what's in the Paisley Caves to the record of lake level variations that have been developed by shorelines. And the Paisley Caves probably doesn't need a ton of introduction if you're archaeologically inclined, but it's a very famous site in the Great Basin, mainly because it's one of the places with the earliest radiocarbon dates and confirmed human DNA, some of which are more than 14,000 years old. And these have been confirmed in this set of stratified sediments within the caves that span over the past 15,000 years. There's lots of items of material culture in there. There's tons and tons of zooarchaeological remains. That means things like bird bones, fish bones, antelope bones, extinct camel bones, and horse bones, and a huge array of faunal remains in here, of which the fish remains that I'm going to talk about are just a part. And this stratified sequence has been shown by about 250 radiocarbon dates across the site to be more or less continuous over the last 15,000 years, which gives us a really good opportunity to compare variation in things like fish abundance through time. And so one of the interesting things about the Paisley Caves is that there are literally thousands of fish remains just in the 2 excavation units in 2 caves that we studied. And a small amount of them are rainbow red-bound trout, but the vast majority of them are this fish here, which is kind of an unassuming fish. It's a small fish, but it's a very hardy fish, and it makes total sense that it's in the Paisley Caves, and you'll see why as I go on. But more than 99% of the specimens that were identifiable in the Paisley Caves are this fish, the tui chub, and some of these remains look like this. And so going forward, there was an opportunity to look at both the abundance of these fish through the time depth sequence of the caves, and also to look at the chemical and isotopic composition of the bones themselves, which is diagnostic of changing environment in which the fish were living back through time. So the tui chub make total sense to be in the Paisley Caves because they are an endemic species to the Great Basin, specifically in closed watersheds of the Great Basin and along the kind of Owens Valley, Eastern Sierra chain. I'm showing this plot here of reported distribution in watersheds of the Great Basin here. And they're uniquely suited to living in highly fluctuating water quality conditions. They can live in high salinity and alkalinity. They can also live in freshwater. They can tolerate low oxygen saturation, and they also have a very wide-ranging diet of both pelagic and benthic foods. And the result of this is when lake levels go up in places like Pyramid Lake or Owens Lake, and the fish can tolerate the salinity, they will move into this type of habitat. When lake levels go down, as they did in Owens Lake when too much water diversion dried the lake out, which we've heard about today, they will move back into streams and springs and freshwater environments. And so in the Chewaucan Basin today, there are still tui chub that exist in spring outlets. I believe there's some in the northern part of the Summer Lake Basin, and some in the northern part of the Abert Lake Basin, but they do not exist in the lakes today because it's too saline. If we look at the time depth of fish in the Paisley Caves going back in time, however, we see that by far the most abundant period of fish abundance within the caves is at this earliest, lowest levels of the caves, and they decline as we go towards the present by about 12,000 years. They're really low. And in fact, they're so low that I've blown up the density within the sediments, which is what is shown here on the y-axis, by 10 times in the blue here, so that you can see it better in these younger levels of the cave. But it continues to decline through that kind of early Holocene period. And then as we enter into the middle Holocene, that period from 4,000 to 8,000 years ago, it's at its lowest. And then in the last 3,000 years where we have record, it's come back in again as well. And so just the distribution of amount of fish within the caves is already, I think, indicating something about changing environment within the Chewaucan Basin through time. And so I guess I already outed myself on what I was going to say there. The second thing that we looked at with the tui chub was to look at the isotopic composition of their bones. And lakes are a chemical they are filled with chemicals, and some of those chemicals have isotopes of things like carbon and oxygen, things that have the same atomic number but different atomic weight, that move in a hydrologic system in ways that are characteristic of hydrologic processes. And when you are a fish and you live in water, you take oxygen in with a composition related to the composition of the water that you are living in. So the O comes from the water. You bring in carbon into your bone structure with a composition that is related to the dissolved inorganic carbon that's in the water. And things like strontium and other +2 cations can substitute into the calcium phosphate of bone that can also be diagnostic signatures of places within the watershed that water, and at least the solutes in the water, were being derived from. And so by looking at these things and using the fact that Tui chub can live in such a wide variety of habitats, we can also use this as another tool to try to understand what the distribution of habitats versus lakes, evaporated lakes and wetlands was through time. And that's because in a closed basin lake system like this, particularly for oxygen and carbon isotopes, oxygen and carbon isotopes tend to get higher in this kind of lake end member situation as they get modified by evaporation and exchange with the atmosphere. And they tend to be lower in streams and springs. And there's a lot of fractionation physics and other processes that are associated with that. But this is the basics that we need to know for the purposes of this talk, so that if we're in this stream spring end member, we're reflecting some type of an environment like this, or maybe like a river like the Chewaucan River. And if we're at this other environment, we're reflecting something more like a highly evaporated lake. It doesn't necessarily have to be a super saline lake, but it has to be highly evaporated relative to the incoming water. The balance of solutes is another thing entirely, or it may be some mixing in between. So if I just show the record itself, I've just shown the lake level record here. Here's fish abundance. Here's oxygen isotopes, carbon isotopes, strontium isotopes, and I'll just say a few things about these as we go through. But the bottom line is that we found that there was a very good correspondence between the abundance and the composition of fish, the habitat that they were reflecting, and what we knew independently about lake state. So that at the time when we knew the lake to be at its maximum and the two sides of the Chewaucan Basin were combined, fish were by far the most abundant, and that declined more or less with the decline in the lake. And when we get into this middle Holocene period in particular, the abundance of fish is the lowest as well. And then at the time when lowest lake levels were inferred, and then fish came back in at a higher level, still pretty low though, in the late Holocene. Similarly, the oxygen isotopes indicate the highest, most evaporated water values during this deep lakes period, indicative of a evaporated closed lake. And they decline along with abundance to their lowest levels during this middle Holocene period, which has a composition in oxygen that's most similar to unmodified fresh stream and spring water today. And that comes back in a little bit as we move up into the late Holocene. Carbon is a little more complicated, but it more or less follows the same pattern, which is lastly, the strontium, which is interesting because in the Chewaucan Basin, the high elevation parts of the drainage basin in both this basin and in the Fart Rock Basin to the north tends to be associated with low compositions of strontium. As you move to lower elevations in the basin to different bedrock types, you tend to have higher strontium compositions. And so the indication here is that when we're seeing these high compositions during the period of high lake levels, this is an indication that more of the drainage basin is providing runoff and solutes in terms of strontium to the lake. And as we move into this middle Holocene period, we're getting increasingly less input of water from these lower watershed areas, and it's retracting into the higher elevation parts of the basin. So that gets lowest during the middle Holocene, gets higher again as we move into the late Holocene. And so the bottom line here is there's very good agreement between what we're seeing from the fish in terms of their abundance and the extent of the lakes. And we're seeing the kinds of patterns of changes in the isotope compositions that we would expect given the changes in abundance of habitat available to the fish through time. And so just to kind of depict this, let's just compare and contrast the late Holocene and the middle Holocene and think about what things might look like for the future. As we saw in Dave Herbst's talk earlier, he said that it seemed pretty clear that since the 1700s or so, that lake levels in Abert Lake were maybe similar to what were seen in the historical record. And I think that's probably true. And in fact, I would extend that based on dating of shorelines near where the modern historical level is along here, that probably goes for moving back to about 4,000 years ago. So last 4,000 years or so, probably both Abert Lake and Summer Lake were probably within the range of what we know to be historical variability. When we get back into the middle Holocene, there's basically just no record of shorelines at all. And so it's hard to say that the absence of evidence is evidence of absence, but if you move off of those rocky shorelines, you don't have anything to date anymore, and along with some other evidence throughout the Great Basin that this middle Holocene period was exceptionally dry, along with the lowest fish abundance and by far the lowest oxygen isotope compositions, suggesting that fish that were existing were living in freshwater locations, suggests that maybe the middle Holocene looked something more like this, at least more frequently than the late Holocene did. And this may be more of an analog for what we're seeing now, where we have a frequently dry Abert Lake and Summer Lake, and the only riparian habitat or wetlands habitat available for fish, at least, is relegated to near to where spring discharge and river discharge is coming out onto the marshes today. And so what the geologic record is telling us is that the more arid middle Holocene climate, which is known to be arid across the Great Basin, left the Chewaucan Basin lakes dry more frequently than they are today. And this is just, a function of natural climate variability. The middle Holocene is in some ways analogous to what might happen in the future. It probably had higher summertime temperatures, somewhat higher evaporative demand, but in some ways it's different because greenhouse gas forcing is a lot different. But it's kind of the best analog the recent geologic record has for us to show a period in which it seems like the lakes were dry more often than not. As I already said, the last 4,000 years or so, Abert and Summer Lake were probably similar in size to the historical record. And fish abundance and their habitat closely followed these lake level variations over the past 15,000 years. What needs more work in order to kind of place a paleoclimatic context on this late Holocene part of the record is that the record that I've shown you is pretty low resolution. It's probably like snapshots in thousands to hundreds to thousands of years. And so in order to say, like, what was the response of Abert Lake to something like the 1930s Dust Bowl drought or mega droughts during the medieval climate anomaly or something like that, we would need to do more work to try to constrain lake level in the past. And in order to really be able to say anything about how much water would be needed to be left in the lake in order to maintain it under more arid climate conditions, we would need to quantify it through some sort of hydrologic modeling. And so I think that that is a great idea, and I will leave it at that if people have questions.
Thank you, Adam. Very interesting. Do we have questions? Adam, so mid-Holocene, what was the effect on human use in that area? What sort of animals were around? How hospitable or inhospitable was that?
I think that what most archaeologists think is that people just moved to exploit different parts of the landscape under the Middle Holocene. It wasn't like a barren wasteland, I don't think, but there are moves like in the Fort Rock Basin to the north towards exploiting spring discharge and like Paulina Marsh type resources more intensively during that time period. But I mean, it wasn't, people didn't leave the region completely during that time. I mean, obviously, the fish that were coming into the cave were probably brought in partly by people, and the amount of fish in the cave goes down a lot during the Middle Holocene, which may provide some evidence that people shifted away from using that resource. But I mean, I don't think it was dire conditions, but the intensity of use changed on the landscape during that time period.
Okay, any other questions? You can just unmute yourself and ask a question if you'd like.
Yeah, Adam, Dave Herbst. The native people in Mono Lake, they had a history of using the fly pupae as a food resource. The kuchabi, they called it. I'm wondering if there's any evidence of the use of that in maybe pupa casings that remain from the Paisley Caves.
I'm not aware of that. I mean, I do know that, you know, there are a lot of insects and other things that were consumed by people in the caves. But I think honestly, the Holocene part of the record is some of the least studied from a zooarchaeological perspective and that kind of trace fossil perspective. So, I mean, a lot of it comes from times when the lakes were pretty big. I don't know whether, you know, to what extent there was good habitat for flies at that time, but I mean, the answer is I don't know.
Yeah, if the lakes were really big and low salinity, unlikely that there'd be much fly productivity. It's got to be in that sweet range of about 25 to 100 grams per liter.
Well, I would like to very much thank all the speakers. Thank you so much. And if you people listening would like to note your appreciation, you can do that through the reactions link at the bottom. We had 110 people at the max, or 112, I think it was, and about 90 now. So this is obviously an issue of great interest. Thanks very much to all of those who are interested. It is an area where things are not going well for the lake, for agriculture, and we do hope that the discussions that have been mentioned will lead to solutions that are amenable to both problems. And I have no doubt that it's our scientific understanding that will enable us to make the most propitious decisions. So thanks very much. I think I'm just going to leave it open here in case some questions arise. So you don't necessarily have to rush off, but thanks very much. This is the end of the formal part. Stan, what are you still there, Stan? What are you thinking about I mean, is some of these bird populations really quite close to major problems, do you reckon? Or what do you think? How, I mean, you mentioned that some populations in the past have been very, very abundant and then it crashed before you're able to sort of take stock of things. Are you feeling pretty panicked about that, or?
Well, I don't know about panicked is the right word, but you know, as I said in the talk, abundance is no guarantee against extinction. We've seen that over and over again, and things can change dramatically. And I think the most worrisome thing right now is the fact that what we're seeing is decline in the quality and availability of habitat at a variety of sites.
Yeah.
And you know, if it's just one site and everything else is remaining in good condition, well, that's one scenario. But when you're seeing declines across the board, that's a whole nother matter. And particularly troublesome is the rapid decline of Great Salt Lake. Just because any way you cut it, it's a mega site from the standpoint of bird use as well as the invertebrates there that support them. But it's not just Great Salt Lake. Even if everything else were gone and Great Salt Lake was still in good shape, we'd see smaller bird populations. So that's again, I'm not panicking, but it's not a very optimistic picture. And it's why we said at the end of my talk, we need regional solutions, but we also need local solutions. And you got to have them both.
And Adam, I suppose the scenario you were describing around in the Chewaucan was pretty much the same in the Great Salt Lake. So in that middle Holocene, the Great Salt Lake was pretty dry, I suppose.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
So, I mean, things have come back, but of course you're dealing there with timescales of hundreds of thousands of years, aren't you? And we're seeing
oftentimes the resolution of the record is not very high, and so there could be periods of decades with substantial lakes in there, but it was dry more frequently than not.
Yeah.
So, Adam, one thing I'm wondering about is the inference of dryness is coming from the absence of the tui chub, but they likely don't survive very well above around probably no more than 30 grams per liter. So you could still have lakes that support a pretty abundant community of organisms that are not detectable during that period of time. So do you think that the inferences from the other chemical evidence that you have are sufficiently strong to say that the lake really was dry, lakes really were dry for prolonged periods of time in that era?
One of the main pieces of evidence for prolonged drying of the lakes during the Middle Holocene is the fact that the tephra from Mount Mazama from Crater Lake that was erupted about 7,500 years ago was erupted onto what have been inferred to mud-cracked playas in the Summer Lake Basin, and then have subsequently been reworked into sand dunes since that time. And so I think the answer is it would be nice to know a lot better what the history of the Holocene variations of the lake was in order to make that inference. I think the evidence suggests that the lake was drier than it was in the late Holocene during the mid Holocene. But yeah, I think it would be hard to say for sure that the lakes were totally dry, and certainly not the entire time.
I noticed Rebecca Fruss
So
is still.
I think it's an ecological.
You go ahead, Dave.
I was just saying, I think it's ecologically important to know that, insofar as the functioning of the Lake Abert ecosystem as we know it today, anyway.
Sure.
Yeah.
I was just noticing that Rebecca Fruss is still with us. Thanks for joining in, Rebecca. Rebecca is with the USGS in Nevada and Reno, I believe, and is leading the response to the Saline Lakes Act directives from Congress. Did you want to say anything, Rebecca, about what's happened since the meetings, those nice meetings you had, which were now, I can't remember, a couple of months ago at the least, and your plans for going forward? If you'd like to say something, fine. If not, no worries. Not at this time. Okay, very good. Yep. Boy, we've had a lot of good information here. Really, really good. Any other discussion?
Just
Sue?
one thing I wanted to mention is that I know from talking to Joe Gell, the guy, who studied Phalaropes and the grebes at Abert, is when there are bad years at Abert, he gets reports of dead grebes he got them near the Los Angeles airport, weirdly enough. And I guess the message is bad years at Abert mean birds die. I mean, birds don't put up little signs that say, here I am, I'm dead. You just don't find them for the most part. So that I think that often we don't know exactly, trying to measure mortality in a bird population is very difficult. And I think that we should be aware that, the fact that we even find some birds dead in these bad years should be a sign that things really are not going well, and points to the importance of really what Abert is doing for, fattening up these birds before they go on migration. You can't just lose the middle part of the range of a bird and think that the population is going to survive.
Is anything known about the decisions the birds might make? Say, let's say if Abert is in a bad way, but
Right.
But there would be resources at the Great Salt Lake or at Mono still. Is there a way that is it known how birds would make that decision? I'm thinking in Australia, where apparently
Right.
all of the pelicans feed on Lake Eyre, which is sort of in south of Uluru, south of the centre.
Yeah.
But often that's dry, and they're in other places. But when that's wet, apparently they all go there. How are decisions made like that might involve thousands of kilometres?
I mean, they're making, let's just take avocets. Avocets are making a decision to go north when things are, they in a normal year, they decide to fly north to spend their post-breeding time, which can be months. I mean, that's kind of crazy, because then they turn around and they fly south to the Salton Sea or down into Baja. So, I mean, in a sense, that's a decision. But we actually have a paper that we wrote about kind of the flip side. What happens when which is probably not going to happen in the future, but it's an example. And this is a Dave thing too, is like, I can't remember, a number of years ago, it was so wet that Abert became too fresh. How did this work? I forget how this works, because Abert was too fresh. Or maybe I can't, the situation was basically Abert was either too fresh or too salty. And so the avocets moved over to Summer Lake, the lake, not Summer Lake Wildlife Area. And so they're obviously, I think they have an idea, I believe, that they understand there's a matrix out there and that there are options, and they're obviously choosing. I mean, I'm being very, very anthropomorphic when I'm using these terms, but they're obviously making decisions to go one place or another based on who knows what, but they need to eat. And so they're going.
Yeah, that seems like a pretty short commute, because the bird can fly at 30.
Oh, right. No, I know, they go up.
But between Abert, Mono, and Great Salt Lake, boy, how do they stand? Yeah,
I think part of it, Theo, depends too on what condition the birds are in as they're
Right.
flying. Do they have good fat reserves? If so, can you go another 100 kilometers or 200 kilometers? Well, probably. If you're already on the very lean side, that's a real problem. And we look at bar-tailed godwits that fly from the Alaska Peninsula to New Zealand without stopping. Well, the ones we don't hear about are the ones that run out of fat halfway to New Zealand, because they can't survive by landing on the water. They're gone.
Yeah.
I mean, they can metabolize some muscle up to a point, but not when you're using those muscles to fly as well. So a lot of it is what condition are they arriving in, and I think part of the challenge here is, let's say phalaropes coming from Chaplin Lakes up in Saskatchewan, are they flying nonstop to Abert? We don't know. Are they in good condition when they arrive? We don't know. So there's so much we don't know about these migrants that really makes it hard for us to, I think, evaluate what is happening and what's going to happen if conditions worsen.
Yeah, I wonder how much they key into the superabundant food resources, whether it's the flies or the shrimp, which would be really easy for them to visualize and make some, behavioral decision based on that. I mean, maybe what you were talking about, Sue, was at very high lake levels. the alkali fly becomes less abundant, and indeed so do the brine shrimp, because you start to get these invertebrate predators and competitors being an important part of the community at that point, and they decimate those super abundant populations. I mean, there's still obviously insect and invertebrate life in the lakes, but not that super abundant, easily recognized food source that aggregates either right along the shores or in the kind of brine shrimp boils that Ron had pictures of.
Right.
You know, that's something that seems like it'd be a really important cue to a decision about whether or not to leave or stay.
Right. Right.
And is there some long distance network that can communicate to incoming birds or birds who have found themselves at the wrong place that, hey, things are really good over there, you know, but it's 100, 200, 300, 400 kilometers away? Is there something that exists like that? Some sense that they can pick? I mean, you know, if you think of the mariners in the South Pacific Islands, those islands are miles apart, but they had sort of ways they could detect when there's bird activity, it was near a land, there were other indicators. Is there something that birds would be using that to help them to find alternatives when things get bad?
Invoking avian telepathy here.
All right. You know, one thing that's, I don't know. So we had the Willamette Valley Bird Symposium in Corvallis last weekend, and I don't know if Pepper Trail is still on the line here, but he's I guess on the board for what's it called, on the board for the for what? Pepper, there you go.
There he is.
There he is.
For Playa, it's called.
I always forget, right? And we were talking about how it might be very helpful. I'm sure it would be very helpful to have a MODIS network put up on Summer Lake and Abert, or, you know, have sort of a network put up so that you could, I mean, the birds aren't going to tell you where they're going, but you could at least see who was going through. And we were talking about this USGS money that's coming through, that might be an amazing use of money for these wetlands, would be to set up a mosaic of these MODIS towers. And Pepper, you should talk about it, because you were the one that was spearheading that. But it would be amazing to figure out where things were going.
Yeah, I mean, clearly one of the themes of a lot of the talks today have been our data gaps. And if we knew more about where the birds were coming from, that would be very helpful at kind of predicting the impacts of some of the changes that we're expecting to see. And this MODIS technology of sort of contactless tracking of birds once they have these tags on would be one of the ways that you could do that. And a network that would connect some of these sites, like the sites where the eared grebes and the phalaropes are breeding, with the sites that they're spending their staging at, like Abert, would be a very powerful and relatively cheap way to do that, as long as there were enough birds that were carrying the tags. So I think that is something that would be a good use of some of the funds that have been made available by this Saline Act. And as far as the question about, you know, how do birds know where there might be better resources, there's a lot of work that's been done on central place foraging, et cetera, that birds definitely can share information over relatively short distances. And some birds, like the pelicans that Theo mentioned in Australia, are big birds that soar and can be seen for long distances. And I think there's no question that they get information from seeing distant flocks. And that's how a congregation like at Lake Eyre may happen. But whether that technique would be useful for these species, which are much smaller, a lot of whom migrate at night, you know, I just don't think that would probably be a technique that they could use to share information. I suspect, I mean, it's just a suspicion, but I suspect that they just fly on when they come to a place like Abert and they're expecting resources and it's dry. They have no choice but to fly on. And as Sue said, a lot of them probably don't make it.
they're probably headed for the Salton Sea, but it's a long way.
Thanks, Pepper Trail. Could you write something in the chat with your contact information, because there'll be a record of that, especially with regard to your suggestion that this MOTIS system ought to be, considered in the USGS research portfolio. And also, Jennifer Davis has a comment. We're currently planning MOTIS stations for just this reason. Jen, yeah, you want to tell us about that?
Yeah, thanks. I've been a part of the Pacific Northwest MOTIS partnership now for probably going on 2 years. I think the group has been going. We are just about to have a full-time MOTIS coordinator for the first time in the region through American Bird Conservancy. I'm sorry, I should have introduced myself. I'm with American Bird Conservancy. And in the middle of next month, so just in a couple of weeks now, we'll have a full-time MOTIS coordinator who will be instrumental in helping build out the network across the region. So hopefully some of these funding sources down the line that we have, there's a lot of people that have money for MOTIS stations that just don't have the capacity to physically build them or need that guidance. And so we're really hoping that this will catalyze the entire effort. I know there are currently plans, I think it's through ODF&W or BLM that have already targeted Summer Lake and Lake Abert. So
could you just step back a little bit? What is this? These are signal reception towers or something that would pick up signals from birds that have been tagged.
So the MOTIS network, or the MOTIS radio telemetry system is it uses a transmitter, that you can put on animals, so migrating animals, and they're capable of tagging very small animals, even to the size of a dragonfly or monarch butterfly. So it's really handy for small migrating birds, especially. And the radio receivers are passive antenna that you place along the landscape. So the better the network is, the better the data that you put on any target species across that migrate. So what we're really trying to do at the moment is build out that infrastructure for the receivers. So anybody who does have a question that could be answered by this technology can start deploying the tags on any target species. So
the other thing is that USGS is involved in this in many ways throughout the biological division. And Joan Hager at Fresk in Corvallis is helping with it. But there is a lot of interest. The other thing, Theo, with these is if somebody is interested, if somebody up in Alaska is into MOTIS, when their birds come through in Oregon, we can pick them up. So it's like you can build on this so that you really can cash in on people's banding efforts, or attaching the tag efforts in a big way as more and more and more people attach tags and put up towers. So it's pretty incredible. And already building on the USGS efforts, I think would help, or at least it's a start.
What's the distance between towers or reception places you'd like to have?
Well, that depends on the landscape. I think the typical range is about 10 kilometers up to maybe 20 kilometers if it's high on a ridge line with almost no obstruction. So it really depends on the location and the topography. But one of the things that this new coordinator position will do is try to strategically build out the infrastructure so we can fill in gaps across the landscape. Right now, especially in the eastern US, they're probably 10 years ahead of us, where the infrastructure has been put up kind of ad hoc, project by project. We have interest in this area, I have interest in this area. My birds will get picked up by your towers and vice versa. So we're trying to look at this holistically here in the Pacific Northwest and the West and the Pacific Flyway in general. Where can we put up the most towers in the most strategic location to benefit everyone?
Can I jump in here, please? My name is Tammy Barnes, and I am the OSU field faculty located in Lake County. And I think that the towers are interesting. I would love to see some at Harney County, because just from my observation is that it seems like birds go to Harney if there's nothing in the lake. But I like there's a lot of implications that go on here for the community about a lot of this conservation effort. Now, there are lots of boots on the ground. There's lots of efforts in monitoring this watershed, as well as some, heavy duty education about stream restoration, riparian area fixing. And I think the biggest thing that, it seems like I've listened to all of this is that, it's a climate change thing and a lack of precipitation. So, I have concerns about getting in here and changing the life of my community members by taking it away from irrigation water to put into the lake, because then is that a short-term fix or is it a long-term fix? So what my data scientists, my climate scientists are basically saying is that, because we have ET and lack of precipitation, that's something bigger than any of us can look at. And I also invite, anybody that would like to have a conversation about what's going on here, because these folks are very concerned. They love this land. They love this county. They want to do the right thing, but give us some tools in the tool bucket where either give us funds so we can monitor water use. There's been very little water use, especially groundwater. Groundwater is really something around here that, we have some funky geology, and it just, nobody knows where it goes. It's the same with Summer Lake. We're not sure, how that actually feeds. There's very much contention about water. So these folks want to work with and come up with a good solution that keeps their livelihoods and does the right thing. So,
Tammy, can you turn on your video so we can see you?
Sure.
Yeah, good on you. Yeah, point well taken.
Because these are people that, I'm an ag agent. I work for cooperative extension. This is I'm the go-between. So we like to have science. I don't know why my camera's.
Yeah, that's good. We can see you. Yeah.
Okay. So we like to have some data so these folks can do some nice data-driven management decisions, still keep their livelihood and help the ecosystem. But we got to come together and talk about that, because, the big picture is that it really isn't what's happening here in this county. It's really big. It's bigger than all of us.
It is.
So,
it is. And it might be so big that...
to pinpoint, there's a little bit of pinpointing and finger pointing going on here that it really, can we do a better job irrigation? Yes. And that is my job this year. We are going to do some monitoring, because I don't think that we're using as much water as you think we are.
Yeah, Tammy, we didn't talk about irrigation today because we don't want to.
We did put an irrigation in there because the water diversion is irrigation.
It was mentioned a couple of times, but
yes, the reality is that it does happen. Can we do a better job? Probably. Is it the sole cause? No, it's climate. So, but there are some other ecosystem services that can come about. Intermountain has, and NRCS has pushed flood irrigation for wetlands for birds in the southern part of this county pretty hard. And there's been significant amount of monies that have been dumped here for landowners. And the landowners are going, hey, we're doing a good thing because this is what they've told us. So now we're going, nope.
That was more than 2 decades ago, but
they're still funding that. Right
I know,
now.
but the decision was made. Thank you. Please talk to your farmers about whenever people mention measuring water, we get negative responses. So
absolutely, because they're frightened about their livelihood. I'm inviting people to come and talk to me as the in-between. Yeah. So we can understand what's going on both sides, because once we have a dialogue on the table, maybe we all collectively can come up with some best management practices for land use around here.
Well, I think that's exactly, anybody that mentioned any changes mentioned the importance of doing it in the context of doing the
Well,
right thing with
you
their
know,
animals. So listen,
It
let's.
should start, it should
We heard you.
start with
Join in the
extensions.
please join in the discussions that we have with the Chewaucan Watershed Collaborative. Now, I would like to, Jennifer, could you write something also in the chat just for contact, so that and follow up with USGS when there's an opportunity about this idea of using this opportunity for building up the what you might call it, the network for those contact towers. Yes, thank you. I believe Larry is probably no longer on the talk. Larry O'Neill, are you still here? Or Erica? No, but they mentioned also the importance of building up the agromet stations that for measuring various aspects of weather, the rainfall and so on. And the fact is that, as Ron said, there are no, Ron Larson, there's no closely positioned station to Lake Abert. And so to understand things at Abert, to understand what might happen if you had more water in there, is it all going to just evaporate in 5 minutes? You need to know the situation. So I think we probably need to have an agromet station in the Chewaucan Marsh around Paisley, and one at the lake. So that's something I want to follow on to. I think that was an interesting point that came out, because Larry and Erica mentioned that they've got a program already going to increase the density of the agromet stations. Rebecca, maybe if you could make note of that, please. Any other discussions?
Yeah, Theo, this is Ron Larson. I just want to thank everybody for participating in this, especially the speakers, but everybody listening. Gosh, there was so much information presented. I'm still trying to make sense of it all. And, I think what Theo's done, brought us all together, has really been so helpful. And hopefully maybe we can, do some more of these kind of things and share information, because I think a lot of you that work in the Great Basin feel like sometimes you're the only person out there. And yeah, we need to work together as much as we can and share information and sort of beat the drum for more research money so we can fill in some of these gaps. So thank you all for participating, and I look forward to hearing some more from you and maybe meeting more of you in person.
We will, we've been recording everything. In some time, that recording will be processed so that it's digestible to a person. And together, I believe, with the chat that has sort of some comments and some heavy duty data I can see over there, citations. This will all be available to everybody who's been online and who has registered and maybe couldn't make it today. So I think we're winding down. Thanks so much. I agree, Ron. It was very informative, and we need information now to make these decisions that you heard about from Lakeview. There's a lot of concern from people living in the Chewaucan and nearby, but we also have a dry lake, and that's not a natural state for a lake. So we've also got a really dire situation. In my view, it's data that'll help to move us forward. So thanks very much. I'm going to shut things down, I think. And thanks again to speakers and to attendees. Good night.
Good night, Theo. Good night, everybody.
Stop the dang recording.